Book 2. Chapter 1. The ever-memorable oath of the States General, taken at the Tennis Court of Versailles, was followed by the royal sitting of the 23d of June. In this séance, the king declared that the orders must vote separately and threatened, if further obstacles were met with, to himself act for the good of the people. The queen looked on M. Necker, not accompanying the king as treachery or criminal cowardice. She said that he had converted a remedy into poison, that being in full popularity, his audacity, in openly disavowing the step taken by his sovereign, had emboldened the factious, and led away the whole assembly, and that he was the more culpable inasmuch as he had the evening before given her his word to accompany the king. In vain did M. Necker endeavor to excuse himself by saying that his advice had not been followed. Soon afterwards, the insurrections of the 11th, 12th, and 14th of July opened the disastrous drama with which France was threatened. The massacre of M. de Flesselles and M. de Launay drew bitter tears from the queen, and the idea that the king had lost such devoted subjects wounded her to the heart. The character of the movement was no longer merely that of a popular insurrection. Cries of "Vive la nation," "Vive le roi," "Vive la liberté," threw the strongest light upon the views of the reformers. Still the people spoke of the king with affection, and appeared to think him favorable to the national desire for the reform of what were called abuses. But they imagined that he was restrained by the opinions and influence of the Comte d'Artois and the queen, and those two august personages were therefore objects of hatred to the malcontents. The dangers incurred by the Comte d'Artois determined the king's first step with the States General. He attended their meeting on the morning of the 15th of July with his brothers, without pomp or escort. He spoke standing and uncovered, and pronounced these memorable words: "I trust myself to you. I only wish to be at one with my nation, and, counting on the affection and fidelity of my subjects, I have given orders to the troops to remove from Paris and Versailles." The king returned on foot from the chamber of the States General to his palace. The deputies crowded after him and formed his escort, and that of the princes who accompanied him. The rage of the populace was pointed against the Comte d'Artois, whose unfavorable opinion of the double representation was an odious crime in their eyes. They repeatedly cried out, "The king forever, in spite of you and your opinions, Monseigneur." One woman had the impudence to come up to the king and ask him whether what he had been doing was done sincerely, and whether he would not be forced to retract it. The courtyards of the chateau were thronged with an immense concourse of people. They demanded that the king and queen, with their children, should make their appearance in the balcony. The queen gave me the key of the inner doors, which led to the Dauphin's apartments, and desired me to go to the Duchesse de Polignac to tell her that she wanted her son, and had directed me to bring him myself into her room, where she waited to show him to the people. The Duchess said this order indicated that she was not to accompany the prince. I did not answer. She squeezed my hand, saying, "Ah, Madame Campan, what a blow I receive." She embraced the child and me with tears. She knew how much I loved and valued the goodness and the noble simplicity of her disposition. I endeavored to reassure her by saying that I should bring back the prince to her, but she persisted and said she understood the order and knew what it meant. She then retired to her private room, holding her handkerchief to her eyes. One of the under-governesses asked me whether she might go with the Dauphin. I told her the queen had given no order to the contrary, and we hastened to her majesty, who was waiting to lead the prince to the balcony. Having executed this sad commission, I went down into the courtyard, where I mingled with the crowd. I heard 1,000 vociferations. It was easy to see, by the difference between the language and the dress of some persons among the mob, that they were in disguise. A woman, whose face was covered with a black lace veil, seized me by the arm with some violence, and said, calling me by my name, "I know you very well. Tell your queen not to meddle with government any longer. Let her leave her husband and our good States General to effect the happiness of the people." At the same moment a man, dressed much in the style of a marketman, with his hat pulled down over his eyes, seized me by the other arm and said, "Yes, yes. Tell her over and over again that it will not be with these states as with the others, which produced no good to the people. That the nation is too enlightened in 1789 not to make something more of them, and that there will not now be seen a deputy of the tiers état making a speech with one knee on the ground. Tell her this, do you hear?" I was struck with dread, The queen then appeared in the balcony. "Ah," said the woman in the veil, "the Duchess is not with her." "No," replied the man, "but she is still at Versailles. She is working underground, mole-like, but we shall know how to dig her out." The detestable pair moved away from me, and I re-entered the palace, scarcely able to support myself. I thought it my duty to relate the dialogue of these two strangers to the queen. She made me repeat the particulars to the king. About 4 in the afternoon, I went across the terrace to Madame Victoire's apartments. 3 men had stopped under the windows of the throne chamber. "Here is that throne," said one of them aloud, "the vestiges of which will soon be sought for." He added 1,000 invectives against their majesties. I went in to the princess, who was at work alone in her closet, behind a canvas blind, which prevented her from being seen by those without. The 3 men were still walking upon the terrace. I showed them to her, and told her what they had said. She rose to take a nearer view of them, and informed me that one of them was named Saint Huruge, that he was sold to the Duc d'Orléans, and was furious against the government, because he had been confined once under a lettre de cachet as a bad character. The king was not ignorant of these popular threats. He also knew the days on which money was scattered about Paris, and once or twice the queen prevented my going there, saying there would certainly be a riot the next day, because she knew that a quantity of crown pieces had been distributed in the faubourgs. I have seen a 6-franc crown piece, which certainly served to pay some wretch on the night of the 12th of July. The words "Midnight, 12th July 3 pistols" were rather deeply engraven on it. They were, no doubt, a password for the first insurrection Madame Campan. On the evening of the 14th of July, the king came to the queen's apartments, where I was with her majesty alone. He conversed with her respecting the scandalous report disseminated by the factious, that he had had the chamber of the National Assembly undermined in order to blow it up. But he added that it became him to treat such absurd assertions with contempt, as usual. I ventured to tell him that I had the evening before supped with M. Begowan, one of the deputies, who said that there were very respectable persons who thought that this horrible contrivance had been proposed without the king's knowledge. "Then," said His Majesty, "as the idea of such an atrocity was not revolting to so worthy a man as M. Begowan, I will order the chamber to be examined early tomorrow morning. In fact, it will be seen by the king's speech to the National Assembly on the 15th of July that the suspicions excited obtained his attention. I know," said he in the speech in question, "that unworthy insinuations have been made. I know there are those who have dared to assert that your persons are not safe. Can it be necessary to give you assurances upon the subject of reports so culpable, denied beforehand by my known character?" The proceedings of the 15th of July produced no mitigation of the disturbances. Successive deputations of Poissards came to request the king to visit Paris, where his presence alone would put an end to the insurrection. On the 16th, a committee was held in the king's apartments, at which a most important question was discussed: whether His Majesty should quit Versailles and set off with the troops whom he had recently ordered to withdraw, or go to Paris to tranquilize the minds of the people. The queen was for the departure. On the evening of the 16th, she made me take all her jewels out of their cases to collect them in one small box, which she might carry off in her own carriage. With my assistance, she burnt a large quantity of papers, for Versailles was then threatened with an early visit of armed men from Paris. The queen, on the morning of the 16th, before attending another committee at the King's, having got her jewels ready and looked over all her papers, gave me one folded up but not sealed, and desired me not to read it until she should give me an order to do so from the king's room, and that then I was to execute its contents. But she returned herself about 10 in the morning. The affair was decided. The army was to go away without the king. All those who were in imminent danger were to go at the same time. "The king will go to the Hôtel de Ville tomorrow," said the queen to me. "He did not choose this course for himself. There were long debates on the question. At last the king put an end to them by rising and saying, 'Well, gentlemen, we must decide. Am I to go or to stay? I am ready to do either.' The majority were for the king staying. Time will show whether the right choice has been made." I returned the queen the paper she had given me, which was now useless. She read it to me. It contained her orders for the departure. I was to go with her, as well on account of my office about her person as to serve as a teacher to Madame. The queen tore the paper and said, with tears in her eyes, "When I wrote this I thought it would be useful, but fate has ordered otherwise, to the misfortune of us all, as I much fear. After the departure of the troops, the new administration received thanks. Necker was recalled. The artillery soldiers were undoubtedly corrupted. "Wherefore all these guns?" exclaimed the crowds of women who filled the streets. "Will you kill your mothers, your wives, your children? Be afraid," answered the soldiers. "These guns shall rather be leveled against the tyrant's palace than against you." The Comte d'Artois, the Prince de Condé, and their children set off at the same time with the troops. The Duc and Duchesse de Polignac, their daughter, the Duchesse de Guiche, the Comtesse Diane de Polignac, sister of the Duke, and the Abbé de Ballavière, also emigrated on the same night. Nothing could be more affecting than the parting of the Queen and her friend. Extreme misfortune had banished from their minds the recollection of differences to which political opinions alone had given rise. The Queen several times wished to go and embrace her once more after their sorrowful adieu, but she was too closely watched. She desired Madame Campan to be present at the departure of the Duchess, and gave him a purse of 500 louis, desiring him to insist upon her, allowing the Queen to lend her that sum to defray her expenses on the road. The Queen added that she knew her situation, that she had often calculated her income and the expenses occasioned by her place at court, that both husband and wife, having no other fortune than their official salaries, could not possibly have saved anything, however differently people might think at Paris. Madame Campan remained till midnight with the Duchess to see her enter her carriage. She was disguised as a femme de chambre and got up in front of the berlin. She requested Madame Campan to remember her frequently to the Queen, and then quitted forever that palace, that favor, and that influence which had raised her up such cruel enemies. On their arrival at Sens, the travelers found the people in a state of insurrection. They asked all those who came from Paris whether the Polignacs were still with the Queen. A group of inquisitive persons put that question to the Abbé de Ballavière, who answered them in the firmest tone, and with the most cavalier air, that they were far enough from Versailles, and that we had got rid of all such bad people. At the following stage, the postilion got on the doorstep and said to the Duchess, "Madame, there are some good people left in the world. I recognized you all at Sens." They gave the worthy fellow a handful of gold. On the breaking out of these disturbances, an old man above 70 years of age gave the Queen an extraordinary proof of attachment and fidelity. Perrac, a rich inhabitant of the colonies, father of M. Doudenard, was coming from Brussels to Paris. While changing horses, he was met by a young man who was leaving France, and who recommended him, if he carried any letters from foreign countries, to burn them immediately, especially if he had any for the Queen. M. Perrac had one from the Archduchess, the gouvernante of the Low Countries, for Her Majesty. He thanked the stranger, and carefully concealed his packet. But as he approached Paris, the insurrection appeared to him so general and so violent that he thought no means could be relied on for securing this letter from seizure. He took upon him to unseal it, and learned it by heart, which was a wonderful effort for a man at his time of life, as it contained 4 pages of writing. On his arrival at Paris, he wrote it down, and then presented it to the Queen, telling her that the heart of an old and faithful subject had given him courage to form and execute such a resolution. The Queen received M. Perrac in her closet, and expressed her gratitude in an affecting manner most honorable to the worthy old man. Her Majesty thought the young stranger who had apprised him of the state of Paris was Prince George of Hesse-Darmstadt, who was very devoted to her, and who left Paris at that time. The Marquise de Tourzel replaced the Duchesse de Polignac. She was selected by the Queen as being the mother of a family and a woman of irreproachable conduct, who had superintended the education of her own daughters with the greatest success. The King went to Paris on the 17th of July, accompanied by the Marechal de Beauveau, the Duc de Villeroy, and the Duc de Villequier. He also took the Comte d'Estaing and the Marquis de Nesle, who were then very popular, in his carriage. 12 bodyguards and the town guard of Versailles escorted him to the Pont du Jour near Sevres, where the Parisian guard was waiting for him. His departure caused equal grief and alarm to his friends, notwithstanding the calmness he exhibited. The Queen restrained her tears and shut herself up in her private rooms with her family. She sent for several persons belonging to her court. Their doors were locked. Terror had driven them away. The silence of death reigned throughout the palace. They hardly dared hope that the King would return. The Queen had a robe prepared for her, and sent orders to her stables to have all her equipages ready. She wrote an address of a few lines for the assembly, determining to go there with her family, the officers of her palace, and her servants, if the king should be detained prisoner at Paris. She got this address by heart. It began with these words: "Gentlemen, I come to place in your hands the wife and family of your sovereign. Do not suffer those who have been united in heaven to be put asunder on earth." While she was repeating this address, she was often interrupted by tears, and sorrowfully exclaimed, "They will not let him return." It was past 4 when the king, who had left Versailles at 10 in the morning, entered the Hôtel de Ville. At length, at 6 in the evening, M. de Lastors, the king's first page, arrived. He was not half an hour in coming from the Barrière de la Conference to Versailles. Everybody knows that the moment of calm in Paris was that in which the unfortunate sovereign received the tricolored cockade from M. Bailey and placed it in his hat. A shout of "Vive le Roi!" arose on all sides. It had not been once uttered before. The king breathed again, and with tears in his eyes exclaimed that his heart stood in need of such greetings from the people. One of his equerries, M. de Cubières, told him the people loved him, and that he could never have doubted it. The king replied in accents of profound sensibility. Cubières, the French loved Henry Roman IV, and what king ever better deserved to be beloved? Louis Roman XVI cherished the memory of Henry Roman IV. At that moment he thought of his deplorable end, but he long before regarded him as a model, so Levy says on the subject. A tablet with the inscription "Resurrexit" placed upon the pedestal of Henry Roman IV's statue on the accession of Louis Roman XVI flattered him exceedingly. "What a fine compliment," said he. "If it were true, Tacitus himself never wrote anything so concise or so happy." Louis Roman XVI wished to take the reign of that prince for a model. In the following year, the party that raised a commotion among the people on account of the dearness of corn removed the tablet inscribed "Resurrexit" from the statue of Henry Roman IV and placed it under that of Louis Roman XV, whose memory was then detested, as he was believed to have traded on the scarcity of food. Louis Roman XVI, who was informed of it, withdrew into his private apartments, where he was found in a fever shedding tears, and during the whole of that day he could not be prevailed upon either to dine, walk out, or sup. From this circumstance we may judge what he endured at the commencement of the Revolution, when he was accused of not loving the French people. Note by the editor. His return to Versailles filled his family with inexpressible joy. In the arms of the Queen, his sister, and his children, he congratulated himself that no accident had happened. And he repeated several times, "Happily no blood has been shed, and I swear that never shall a drop of French blood be shed by my order." A determination full of humanity, but too openly avowed in such factious times. The king's last measure raised a hope in many that general tranquility would soon enable the assembly to resume its labors and promptly bring its session to a close. The queen never flattered herself so far. M. Bailey's speech to the king had equally wounded her pride and hurt her feelings. Henry Roman IV conquered his people, and here are the people conquering their king. The word "conquest" offended her. She never forgave M. Bailey for this fine academical phrase. 5 days after the king's visit to Paris, the departure of the troops, and the removal of the princes and some of the nobility whose influence seemed to alarm the people, a horrible deed committed by hired assassins proved that the king had descended the steps of his throne without having effected a reconciliation with his people. M. Foulon, adjoint to the administration while M. de Broglie was commanding the army assembled at Versailles, had concealed himself at Villeray. He was there recognized, and the peasants seized him and dragged him to the Hôtel de Ville. The cry for death was heard. The electors, the members of committee, and M. de Lafayette, at that time the idol of Paris, in vain endeavored to save the unfortunate man. After tormenting him in a manner which makes humanity shudder, his body was dragged about the streets, and to the Palais Royal, and his heart was carried by women in the midst of a bunch of white carnations. M. Berthier, M. Foulon's son-in-law, intendant of Paris, was seized at Campigny, at the same time that his father-in-law was seized at Villeray and treated with still more relentless cruelty. The queen was always persuaded that this horrible deed was occasioned by some indiscretion, and she informed me that M. Foulon had drawn up 2 memorials for the direction of the king's conduct at the time of his being called to court on the removal of M. Necker, and that these memorials contained 2 schemes of totally different nature for extricating the king from the dreadful situation in which he was placed. In the first of these projects, M. Foulon expressed himself without reserve respecting the criminal views of the Duc d'Orléans, said that he ought to be put under arrest, and that no time should be lost in commencing a prosecution against him, while the criminal tribunals were still in existence. He likewise pointed out such deputies as should be apprehended, and advised the king not to separate himself from his army until order was restored. His other plan was that the king should make himself master of the revolution before its complete explosion. He advised His Majesty to go to the assembly, and there, in person, to demand the cahiers, and to make the greatest sacrifices to satisfy the legitimate wishes of the people, and not to give the factious time to enlist them in aid of their criminal designs. Cahiers, the memorials or lists of complaints, grievances, and requirements of the electors drawn up by the primary assemblies and sent with the deputies. Madame Adelaide had M. Foulon's 2 memorials read to her in the presence of 4 or 5 persons. One of them, Comte Louis de Narbonne, was very intimate with Madame de Staël, and that intimacy gave the Queen reason to believe that the opposite party had gained information of M. Foulon's schemes. It is known that young Barnave, during an aberration of mind, since expiated by sincere repentance and even by death, uttered these atrocious words. Is then the blood now flowing so pure? When M. Berthier's son came to the assembly to implore the eloquence of M. de Lally to entreat that body to save his father's life. I have since been informed that a son of M. Foulon, having returned to France after these first ebullitions of the Revolution, saw Barnave, and gave him one of those memorials in which M. Foulon advised Louis Roman XVI to prevent the revolutionary explosion by voluntarily granting all that the Assembly required before the 14th of July. Read this memorial, said he. I have brought it to increase your remorse. It is the only revenge I wish to inflict on you. Barnave burst into tears and said to him all that the profoundest grief could dictate. Chapter 3. In February 1790, another matter gave the court much uneasiness. A zealous individual of the name of Favres had conceived the scheme of carrying off the king and effecting a counter-revolution. Monsieur, probably out of mere benevolence, gave him some money, and thence arose a report that he thereby wished to favor the execution of the enterprise. The step taken by Monsieur in going to the Hôtel de Ville to explain himself on this matter was unknown to the Queen. It is more than probable that the king was acquainted with it. When judgment was pronounced upon M. de Favres, the Queen did not conceal from me her fears about the confessions of the unfortunate man in his last moments. I sent a confidential person to the Hôtel de Ville. She came to inform the Queen that the condemned had demanded to be taken from Notre Dame to the Hôtel de Ville to make a final declaration and give some particulars verifying it. These particulars compromised nobody. Favres corrected his last will after writing it, and went to the scaffold with heroic courage and coolness. The judge who read his condemnation to him told him that his life was a sacrifice which he owed to public tranquility. It was asserted at the time that Favres was given up as a victim in order to satisfy the people and save the Baron de Besenval, who was a prisoner in the Abbaye. Thomas Mahy, Marquis de Favres, was accused in the month of December, 1789, of having conspired against the revolution. Having been arrested by order of the Committee of Inquiry of the National Assembly, he was transferred to the Châtelet, where he defended himself with much coolness and presence of mind, repelling the accusations brought against him by Morel, Turcotte, and Marquis with considerable force. These witnesses declared he had imparted his plan to them. It was to be carried into execution by 12,000 Swiss and 12,000 Germans, who were to be assembled at Montargis, thence to march upon Paris, carry off the king, and assassinate Bailly, Lafayette, and Necker. The greater number of these charges he denied, and declared that the rest related only to the levy of a troop intended to favor the revolution preparing in Brabant. The judge having refused to disclose who had denounced him, he complained to the Assembly, which passed to the order of the day. His death was obviously inevitable. During the whole time of the proceedings, the populace never ceased threatening the judges and shouting, "Et la lanterne?" It was even necessary to keep numerous troops and artillery constantly ready to act in the courtyard of the Châtelet. The judges, who had just acquitted M. de Besenval in an affair nearly similar, doubtless dreaded the effects of this fury. When they refused to hear Favres's witnesses in exculpation, he compared them to the tribunal of the Inquisition. The principal charge against him was founded on a letter from M. de Foucault, asking him, "Where are your troops? In which direction will they enter Paris? I should like to be employed among them." Favres was condemned to make the amende honorable in front of the cathedral and to be hanged at the Place de Grève. He heard this sentence with wonderful calmness and said to his judges, "I pity you much if the testimony of 2 men is sufficient to induce you to condemn." The judge having said to him, "I have no other consolation to hold out to you than that which religion affords," he replied nobly, "My greatest consolation is that which I derive from my innocence." Biographique Universelle. On the morning of the Sunday following this execution, M. de la Villerneuil came to my house to tell me that he was going that day to the public dinner of the king and queen to present Madame de Favres and her son, both of them in mourning for the brave Frenchman who fell a sacrifice for his king, and that all the royalists expected to see the queen load the unfortunate family with favors. I did all that lay in my power to prevent this proceeding. I foresaw the effect it would have upon the queen's feeling heart, and the painful constraint she would experience, having the horrible Santera, the commandant of a battalion of the Parisian Guard, behind her chair during dinner time. I could not make M. de la Villerneuil comprehend my argument. The queen was gone to mass, surrounded by her whole court, and I had not even means of apprising her of his intention. When dinner was over, I heard a knocking at the door of my apartment, which opened into the corridor next that of the queen. It was herself. She asked me whether there was anybody with me. I was alone. She threw herself into an armchair and told me she came to weep with me over the foolish conduct of the ultras of the king's party. "We must fall," said she, "attacked as we are by men who possess every talent and shrink from no crime, while we are defended only by those who are no doubt very estimable, but have no adequate idea of our situation. They have exposed me to the animosity of both parties by presenting the widow and son of Favres to me. Were I free to act as I wish, I should take the child of the man who has just sacrificed himself for us and place him at table between the king and myself. But surrounded by the assassins who have destroyed his father, I did not dare even to cast my eyes upon him. The royalists will blame me for not having appeared interested in this poor child. The revolutionists will be enraged at the idea that his presentation should have been thought agreeable to me." However, the queen added that she knew Madame de Favres was in want, and that she desired me to send her next day, through a person who could be relied on, a few rouleaux of 50 louis, and to direct that she should be assured Her Majesty would always watch over the fortunes of herself and her son. In the month of March following, I had an opportunity of ascertaining the king's sentiments respecting the schemes which were continually proposed to him for making his escape. One night about 10 o'clock, Comte de Nistel, who was deputed by the nobility, came to request that I would see him in private, as he had an important matter to communicate to me. He told me that on that very night the king was to be carried off, that the section of the National Guard, that day commanded by M. Daumont, was gained over, and that sets of horses, furnished by some good royalists, were placed in relays at suitable distances, that he had just left a number of the nobility assembled for the execution of this scheme, and that he had been sent to me that I might, through the medium of the queen, obtain the king's positive consent to it before midnight. That the king was aware of their plan, but that his Majesty never would speak decidedly, and that it was necessary he should consent to the undertaking. I greatly displeased Comte de Nistel by expressing my astonishment that the nobility at the moment of the execution of so important a project should send to me, the queen's first woman, to obtain a consent which ought to have been the basis of any well-concerted scheme. I told him also that it would be impossible for me to go at that time to the queen's apartments without exciting the attention of the people in the antechambers, that the king was at cards with the queen and his family, and that I never broke in upon their privacy unless I was called for. I added, however, that M. Campan could enter without being called, and if the count chose to give him his confidence, he might rely upon him. My father-in-law, to whom Comte de Nistel repeated what he had said to me, took the commission upon himself and went to the queen's apartments. The king was playing at whist with the queen, Monsieur and Madame. Madame Elizabeth was kneeling on a stool near the table. M. Campan informed the queen of what had been communicated to me. Nobody uttered a word. The queen broke silence and said to the king, "Do you hear, sire, what Campan says to us?" "Yes, I hear," said the king, and continued his game. Monsieur, who was in the habit of introducing passages from plays into his conversation, said to my father-in-law, "M. Campan, that pretty little couplet again, if you please," and pressed the king to reply. At length the queen said, "But something must be said to Campan." The king then spoke to my father-in-law in these words, "Tell M. de Nistel that I cannot consent to be carried off." The queen enjoined M. Campan to take care and report this answer faithfully. "You understand," added she, "the king cannot consent to be carried off." Comte de Nistel was very much dissatisfied with the king's answer, and went out, saying, "I understand. He wishes to throw all the blame, beforehand, upon those who are to devote themselves for him." He went away, and I thought the enterprise would be abandoned. However, the queen remained alone with me till midnight, preparing her cases of valuables, and ordered me not to go to bed. She imagined the king's answer would be understood as a tacit consent and merely a refusal to participate in the design. I do not know what passed in the king's apartments during the night, but I occasionally looked out at the windows. I saw the garden clear. I heard no noise in the palace, and day at length confirmed my opinion that the project had been given up. "We must, however, fly," said the queen to me, shortly afterwards. "Who knows how far the factious may go? The danger increases every day." The disturbances of the 13th of April, 1790, occasioned by the warmth of the discussions upon Dom Jurel's imprudent motion in the National Assembly, having afforded room for apprehension that the enemies of the country would endeavor to carry off the king from the capital, M. de Lafayette promised to keep watch, and told Louis Roman XVI that if he saw any alarming movement among the disaffected, he would give him notice of it by the discharge of a cannon from Henry Roman IV's battery on the Pont Neuf. On the same night, a few casual discharges of musketry were heard from the terrace of the Tuileries. The king, deceived by the noise, flew to the queen's apartments. He did not find her. He ran to the Dauphin's room, where he found the queen holding her son in her arms. "Madame," said the king to her, "I have been seeking you, and you have made me uneasy." The queen, showing her son, said to him, "I was at my post." Anecdotes of the reign of Louis Roman XVI. This princess received advice and memorials from all quarters. Rivarol addressed several to her, which I read to her. They were full of ingenious observations, but the queen did not find that they contained anything of essential service under the circumstances in which the royal family was placed. Comte du Moustier also sent memorials and plans of conduct. I remember that in one of his writings he said to the king, "Read Telemachus again, sire. In that book which delighted your majesty in infancy, you will find the first seeds of those principles which, erroneously followed up by men of ardent imaginations, are bringing on the explosion we expect every moment." I read so many of these memorials that I could hardly give a faithful account of them, and I am determined to note in this work no other events than such as I witnessed. No other words than such as, notwithstanding the lapse of time, still in some measure vibrate in my ears. Comte de Segur, on his return from Russia, was employed some time by the queen and had a certain degree of influence over her, but that did not last long. Comte Augustus de la Marck likewise endeavored to negotiate for the king's advantage with the leaders of the factious. M. de Fontainges, Archbishop of Toulouse, possessed also the queen's confidence, but none of the endeavors which were made on the spot produced any beneficial result. The Empress Catherine Roman II also conveyed her opinion upon the situation of Louis Roman XVI to the queen, and her majesty made me read a few lines in the empress's own handwriting, which concluded with these words: "Kings ought to proceed in their career undisturbed by the cries of the people, even as the moon pursues her course unimpeded by the baying of dogs." This maxim of the despotic sovereign of Russia was very inapplicable to the situation of a captive king. Meanwhile, the revolutionary party followed up its audacious enterprise in a determined manner, without meeting any opposition. The advice from without, as well from Koblenz as from Vienna, made various impressions upon the members of the royal family, and those cabinets were not in accordance with each other. I often had reason to infer from what the queen said to me that she thought the king, by leaving all the honor of restoring order to the Koblenz party, the princes and the chief of the emigrant nobility assembled at Koblenz, and the name was used to designate the reactionary party, would, on the return of the emigrants, be put under a kind of guardianship which would increase his own misfortunes. She frequently said to me, "If the emigrants succeed, they will rule the roast for a long time. It will be impossible to refuse them anything. To owe the crown to them would be contracting too great an obligation." It always appeared to me that she wished her own family to counterbalance the claims of the emigrants by disinterested services. She was fearful of M. de Calonne, and with good reason. She had proof that this minister was her bitterest enemy, and that he made use of the most criminal means in order to blacken her reputation. I can testify that I have seen in the hands of the Queen a manuscript copy of the infamous Memoirs of the woman de Lamotte, which had been brought to her from London, and in which all those passages where a total ignorance of the customs of courts had occasioned that wretched woman to make blunders which would have been too palpable, were corrected in M. de Calonne's own handwriting. The two King's Guards who were wounded at Her Majesty's door on the 6th of October were M. du Repaire and M. de Miamander de Sainte-Marie. On the dreadful night of the 6th of October, the latter took the post of the former the moment he became incapable of maintaining it. A considerable number of the bodyguards, who were wounded on the 6th of October, betook themselves to the infirmary at Versailles. The brigands wanted to make their way into the infirmary in order to massacre them. M. Viasin, head surgeon of that infirmary, ran to the entrance hall, invited the assailants to refresh themselves, ordered wine to be brought, and found means to direct the Sister Superior to remove the guards into a ward appropriated to the poor, and dress them in the caps and greatcoats furnished by the institution. The good sisters executed this order so promptly that the guards were removed, dressed as paupers, and their beds made, while the assassins were drinking. They searched all the wards, and fancied they saw no persons there but the sick poor. Thus the guards were saved. M. de Miamander was at Paris, living on terms of friendship with another of the guards, who, on the same day, received a gunshot wound from the brigands in another part of the chateau. These two officers, who were attended and cured together at the infirmary of Versailles, were almost constant companions. They were recognized at the Palais Royal and insulted. The Queen thought it necessary for them to quit Paris. She desired me to write to M. de Miamander de Sainte-Marie and tell him to come to me at 8 o'clock in the evening, and then to communicate to him her wish to hear of his being in safety, and ordered me, when he had made up his mind to go, to tell him in her name that gold could not repay such a service as he had rendered, that she hoped some day to be in sufficiently happy circumstances to recompense him as she ought, but that for the present her offer of money was only that of a sister to a brother situated as he then was, and that she requested he would take whatever might be necessary to discharge his debts at Paris and defray the expenses of his journey. She told me also to desire he would bring his friend Bertrand with him, and to make him the same offer. The two guards came at the appointed hour, and accepted, I think, each 100 or 200 louis. A moment afterwards the Queen opened my door. She was accompanied by the King and Madame Elizabeth. The King stood with his back against the fireplace. The Queen sat down upon a sofa, and Madame Elizabeth sat near her. I placed myself behind the Queen, and the two guards stood facing the King. The Queen told them that the King wished to see before they went away two of the brave men who had afforded him the strongest proofs of courage and attachment. Miamander said all that the Queen's affecting observations were calculated to inspire. Madame Elizabeth spoke of the King's gratitude. The Queen resumed the subject of their speedy departure, urging the necessity of it. The King was silent, but his emotion was evident, and his eyes were suffused with tears. The Queen rose, the King went out, and Madame Elizabeth followed him. The Queen stopped and said to me, in the recess of a window, "I am sorry I brought the King here. I am sure Elizabeth thinks with me, if the King had but given utterance to a fourth part of what he thinks of those brave men, they would have been in ecstasies, but he cannot overcome his diffidence." The Emperor Joseph died about this time. The Queen's grief was not excessive. That brother of whom she had been so proud, and whom she had loved so tenderly, had probably suffered greatly in her opinion. She reproached him sometimes, though with moderation, for having adopted several of the principles of the new philosophy, and perhaps she knew that he looked upon our troubles with the eye of the sovereign of Germany rather than that of the brother of the Queen of France. The Emperor on one occasion sent the Queen an engraving which represented unfrocked nuns and monks. The first were trying on fashionable dresses, the latter were having their hair arranged. The picture was always left in the closet and never hung up. The queen told me to have it taken away, for she was hurt to see how much influence the philosophers had over her brother's mind and actions. Mirabeau had not lost the hope of becoming the last resource of the oppressed court, and at this time, some communications passed between the queen and him. The question was about an office to be conferred upon him. This transpired, and it must have been about this period that the assembly decreed that no deputy could hold an office as a minister of the king until the expiration of 2 years after the cessation of his legislative functions. I know that the queen was much hurt at this decision, and considered that the court had lost a promising opening. The Palace of the Tuileries was a very disagreeable residence during the summer, which made the queen wish to go to St. Cloud. The removal was decided on without any opposition. The National Guard of Paris followed the court thither. At this period, new opportunities of escape were presented. Nothing would have been more easy than to execute them. The king had obtained leave to go out without guards and to be accompanied only by an aide-de-camp of M. de Lafayette. The queen also had one on duty with her, and so had the Dauphin. The king and queen often went out at 4 in the afternoon and did not return until 8 or 9. I will relate one of the plans of emigration which the queen communicated to me, the success of which seemed infallible. The royal family were to meet in a wood 4 leagues from St. Cloud. Some persons who could be fully relied on were to accompany the king, who was always followed by his equerries and pages. The queen was to join him with her daughter and Madame Elizabeth. These princesses, as well as the queen, had equerries and pages, of whose fidelity no doubt could be entertained. The Dauphin likewise was to be at the place of rendezvous with Madame de Tourzel. A large berlin and a chaise for the attendants were sufficient for the whole family. The aides-de-camp were to have been gained over or mastered. The king was to leave a letter for the president of the National Assembly on his bureau at St. Cloud. The people in the service of the king and queen would have waited until 9 in the evening without anxiety, because the family sometimes did not return until that hour. The letter could not be forwarded to Paris until 10 o'clock at the earliest. The assembly would not then be sitting. The president must have been sought for at his own house or elsewhere. It would have been midnight before the assembly could have been summoned and couriers sent off to have the royal family stopped, but the latter would have been 6 or 7 hours in advance, as they would have started at 6 leagues distance from Paris. And at this period traveling was not yet impeded in France. The queen approved of this plan, but I did not venture to interrogate her, and I even thought if it were put in execution she would leave me in ignorance of it. One evening in the month of June, the people of the chateau, finding the king did not return by 9 o'clock, were walking about the courtyards in a state of great anxiety. I thought the family was gone, and I could scarcely breathe amidst the confusion of my good wishes when I heard the sound of the carriages. I confessed to the queen that I thought she had set off. She told me she must wait until Mesdames, the king's aunts, had quitted France, and afterwards see whether the plan agreed with those formed abroad. Chapter 4. There was a meeting at Paris for the First Federation on the 14th of July, 1790, the anniversary of the taking of the Bastille. What an astonishing assemblage of 400,000 men, of whom there were not perhaps 200, who did not believe that the king found happiness and glory in the order of things then being established. The love which was borne him by all, with the exception of those who meditated his ruin, still reigned in the hearts of the French in the departments. But if I may judge from those whom I had an opportunity of seeing, it was totally impossible to enlighten them. They were as much attached to the king as to the Constitution, and to the Constitution as to the king, and it was impossible to separate the one from the other in their hearts and minds. The court returned to St. Cloud after the Federation. A wretch named Rotondo made his way into the palace with the intention of assassinating the queen. It is known that he penetrated to the inner gardens. The rain prevented Her Majesty from going out that day. M. de Lafayette, who was aware of this plot, gave all the sentinels the strictest orders, and a description of the monster was distributed throughout the palace by order of the general. I do not know how he was saved from punishment. The police belonging to the king discovered that there was likewise a scheme on foot for poisoning the queen. She spoke to me, as well as to her head physician, M. Vicdazer, about it, without the slightest emotion, but both he and I consulted what precautions it would be proper to take. He relied much upon the Queen's temperance, yet he recommended me always to have a bottle of oil of sweet almonds within reach, and to renew it occasionally, that oil and milk being, as is known, the most certain antidotes to the divilication of corrosive poisons. The Queen had a habit which rendered M. Vic Dazer particularly uneasy. There was always some pounded sugar upon the table in Her Majesty's bedchamber, and she frequently, without calling anybody, put spoonfuls of it into a glass of water when she wished to drink. It was agreed that I should get a considerable quantity of sugar powdered, that I should always have some papers of it in my bag, and that 3 or 4 times a day, when alone in the Queen's room, I should substitute it for that in her sugar basin. We knew that the Queen would have prevented all such precautions, but we were not aware of her reason. One day she caught me alone making this exchange, and told me she supposed it was agreed on between myself and M. Vic Dazer, but that I gave myself very unnecessary trouble. Remember, added she, that not a grain of poison will be put in use against me. The Brinvilliers do not belong to this century. This age possesses calumny, which is a much more convenient instrument of death, and it is by that I shall perish. Even while melancholy presentiments afflicted this unfortunate princess, manifestations of attachment to her person, and to the king's cause, would frequently raise agreeable illusions in her mind, or present to her the affecting spectacle of tears shed for her sorrows. I was one day, during this same visit to St. Cloud, witness of a very touching scene, which we took great care to keep secret. It was 4 in the afternoon, the guard was not set, there was scarcely anybody at St. Cloud that day, and I was reading to the Queen, who was at work in a room the balcony of which hung over the courtyard. The windows were closed, yet we heard a sort of inarticulate murmur from a great number of voices. The Queen desired me to go and see what it was. I raised the muslin curtain and perceived more than 50 persons beneath the balcony. This group consisted of women, young and old, perfectly well dressed in the country costume, old chevaliers of St. Louis, young knights of Malta, and a few ecclesiastics. I told the Queen it was probably an assemblage of persons residing in the neighborhood who wished to see her. She rose, opened the window, and appeared in the balcony. Immediately all these worthy people said to her, in an undertone, "Courage, madame, good Frenchmen suffer for you, and with you they pray for you. Heaven will hear their prayers. We love you, we respect you, we will continue to venerate our virtuous king." The Queen burst into tears and held her handkerchief to her eyes. "Poor Queen, she weeps," said the women and young girls, but the dread of exposing Her Majesty, and even the persons who showed so much affection for her, to observation, prompted me to take her hand and prevail upon her to retire into her room, and, raising my eyes, I gave the excellent people to understand that my conduct was dictated by prudence. They comprehended me, for I heard, "That lady is right," and afterwards, "Farewell, madame," from several of them, and all this in accents of feeling so true and so mournful, that I am affected at the recollection of them even after a lapse of 20 years. A few days afterwards, the insurrection of Nancy took place. The insurrection of the troops at Nancy broke out in August 1790, and was put down by Marshal de Bouille on the last day of that month. See Bouille, p. 195. Only the ostensible cause is known. There was another, of which I might have been in full possession, if the great confusion I was in upon the subject had not deprived me of the power of paying attention to it. I will endeavor to make myself understood. In the early part of September the Queen, as she was going to bed, desired me to let all her people go, and to remain with her myself. When we were alone, she said to me, "The King will come here at midnight. You know that he has always shown you marks of distinction. He now proves his confidence in you by selecting you to write down the whole affair of Nancy from his dictation. He must have several copies of it." At midnight the King came to the Queen's apartments, and said to me, smiling, "You did not expect to become my secretary, and that, too, during the night." I followed the King into the council chamber. I found there sheets of paper, an inkstand, and pens all ready prepared. He sat down by my side and dictated to me the report of the Marquis de Bouille, which he himself copied at the same time. My hand trembled. I wrote with difficulty. My reflections scarcely left me sufficient power of attention to listen to the King. The large table, the velvet cloth, seats which ought to have been filled by none but the King's chief counselors. What that chamber had been, and what it was at that moment, when the king was employing a woman in an office which had so little affinity with her ordinary functions. The misfortunes which had brought him to the necessity of doing so, all these ideas made such an impression upon me that, when I had returned to the queen's apartments, I could not sleep for the remainder of the night, nor could I remember what I had written. The more I saw that I had the happiness to be of some use to my employers, the more scrupulously careful was I to live entirely with my family, and I never indulged in any conversation which could betray the intimacy to which I was admitted. But nothing at court remains long concealed, and I soon saw I had many enemies. The means of injuring others in the minds of sovereigns are but too easily obtained, and they had become still more so, since the mere suspicion of communication with partisans of the revolution was sufficient to forfeit the esteem and confidence of the king and queen. Happily, my conduct protected me with them against calumny. I had left St. Cloud 2 days, when I received at Paris a note from the queen, containing these words: "Come to St. Cloud immediately, I have something concerning you to communicate." I set off without loss of time. Her Majesty told me she had a sacrifice to request of me. I answered that it was made. She said it went so far as the renunciation of a friend's society, that such a renunciation was always painful, but that it must be particularly so to me. That, for her own part, it might have been very useful that a deputy, a man of talent, should be constantly received at my house. But at this moment she thought only of my welfare. The queen then informed me that the ladies of the bedchamber had, the preceding evening, assured her that M. de Beaumetz, deputy from the nobility of Artois, who had taken his seat on the left of the assembly, spent his whole time at my house. Perceiving on what false grounds the attempt to injure me was based, I replied respectfully, but at the same time smiling, that it was impossible for me to make the sacrifice exacted by Her Majesty. That M. de Beaumetz, a man of great judgment, had not determined to cross over to the left of the assembly with the intention of afterwards making himself unpopular by spending his time with the Queen's first woman. And that ever since the 1st of October, 1789, I had seen him nowhere but at the play or in the public walks, and even then without his ever coming to speak to me. That this line of conduct had appeared to me perfectly consistent, for whether he was desirous to please the popular party or to be sought after by the court, he could not act in any other way towards me. The queen closed this explanation by saying, "Oh, it is clear as the day. This opportunity for trying to do you an injury is very ill chosen, but be cautious in your slightest actions. You perceive that the confidence placed in you by the king and myself raises you up powerful enemies." The private communications which were still kept up between the court and Murraybow at length procured him an interview with the queen in the gardens of St. Cloud. He left Paris on horseback, on pretense of going into the country to M. de Clairvaux, one of his friends, but he stopped at one of the gates of the gardens of St. Cloud, and was led to a spot situated in the highest part of the private garden, where the queen was waiting for him. She told me she accosted him by saying, "With a common enemy, with a man who had sworn to destroy monarchy without appreciating its utility among a great people, I should at this moment be guilty of a most ill-advised step. But in speaking to a Murraybow," etc., the poor queen was delighted at having discovered this method of exalting him above all others of his principles. And in imparting the particulars of this interview to me, she said, "Do you know that those words, a Murraybow, appeared to flatter him exceedingly." On leaving the queen, he said to her with warmth, "Madame, the monarchy is saved." It must have been soon afterwards that Murraybow received considerable sums of money. He showed it too plainly by the increase of his expenditure. Already did some of his remarks upon the necessity of arresting the progress of the Democrats circulate in society. Being once invited to meet a person at dinner who was very much attached to the queen, he learned that that person withdrew on hearing that he was one of the guests. The party who invited him told him this with some degree of satisfaction. But all were very much astonished when they heard Murraybow eulogize the absent guest, and declare that in his place he would have done the same. But, he added, they had only to invite that person again in a few months, and he would then dine with the restorer of the monarchy. Murraybow forgot that it was more easy to do harm than good, and thought himself the political atlas of the whole world. Outrages and mockery were incessantly mingled with the audacious proceedings of the revolutionists. It was customary to give serenades under the king's windows on New Year's Day. The band of the National Guard repaired thither on that festival in 1791. In allusion to the liquidation of the debts of the state, decreed by the Assembly, they played solely, and repeatedly, that air from the comic opera of the debts, the burden of which is, "But our creditors are paid, and that makes us easy." On the same day, some conquerors of the Bastille, grenadiers of the Parisian Guard, preceded by military music, came to present to the young Dauphin, as a New Year's gift, a box of dominoes, made of some of the stone and marble of which that state prison was built. The Queen gave me this inauspicious curiosity, desiring me to preserve it, as it would be a curious illustration of the history of the Revolution. Upon the lid were engraved some bad verses, the purport of which was as follows: "Stones from those walls, which enclose the innocent victims of arbitrary power, have been converted into a toy to be presented to you, Monseigneur, as a mark of the people's love, and to teach you their power." The Queen said that M. de Lafayette's thirst for popularity induced him to lend himself, without discrimination, to all popular follies. Her distrust of the general increased daily, and grew so powerful that, when towards the end of the Revolution, he seemed willing to support the tottering throne, she could never bring herself to incur so great an obligation to him. M. de J., a colonel attached to the staff of the army, was fortunate enough to render several services to the Queen, and acquitted himself with discretion and dignity of various important missions. During the Queen's detention in the Temple, he introduced himself into that prison in the dress of a lamplighter, and there discharged his duty unrecognized, Madame Campan. Their Majesties had the highest confidence in him, although it frequently happened that his prudence, when inconsiderate projects were under discussion, brought upon him the charge of adopting the principles of the constitutionals. Being sent to Turin, he had some difficulty in dissuading the princes from a scheme they had formed at that period of re-entering France, with a very weak army, by way of Lyon. And when, in a council which lasted till 3 o'clock in the morning, he showed his instructions, and demonstrated that the measure would endanger the king, the Comte d'Artois alone declared against the plan, which emanated from the Prince de Condé. Among the persons employed in subordinate situations, whom the critical circumstances of the times involved in affairs of importance, was M. de Gauguelat, a geographical engineer at Versailles and an excellent draftsman. He made plans of St. Cloud and Trianon for the Queen. She was very much pleased with them, and had the engineer admitted into the staff of the army. At the commencement of the Revolution, he was sent to Count Esterhazy, at Valenciennes, in the capacity of aide-de-camp. The latter rank was given him solely to get him away from Versailles, where his rashness endangered the Queen during the earlier months of the Assembly of the States General. Making a parade of his devotion to the king's interests, he went repeatedly to the tribunes of the Assembly, and there openly railed at all the motions of the deputies, and then returned to the Queen's antechamber, where he repeated all that he had just heard or had had the imprudence to say. Unfortunately, at the same time that the Queen sent away M. de Gauguelat, she still believed that, in a dangerous predicament requiring great self-devotion, the man might be employed advantageously. In 1791, he was commissioned to act in concert with the Marquis de Bouille in furtherance of the king's intended escape. See the Memoirs of M. de Bouille, those of the Duc de Choiseul, and the account of the journey to Varennes by M. de Fontanges in Weber's Memoirs. Note by the editor. Projectors in great numbers endeavored to introduce themselves not only to the Queen, but to Madame Elizabeth, who had communications with many individuals who took upon themselves to make plans for the conduct of the court. The Baron de Gilliers and M. de Vannes were of this description. They went to the Baron de Macau's, where the princess spent almost all her evenings. The Queen did not like these meetings, where Madame Elizabeth might adopt views in opposition to the king's intentions or her own. The Queen gave frequent audiences to M. de Lafayette. One day, when he was in her inner closet, his aide-de-camp, who waited for him, were walking up and down the great room where the persons in attendance remained. Some imprudent young women were thoughtless enough to say, with the intention of being overheard by those officers, that it was very alarming to see the Queen alone with a rebel and a brigand. I was annoyed at their indiscretion, and imposed silence on them. One of them persisted in the appellation, brigand. I told her that M. de Lafayette well deserved the name of rebel, but that the title of leader of a party was given by history to every man commanding 40,000 men, a capital, and 40 leagues of country. That kings had frequently treated with such leaders, and if it was convenient to the queen to do the same, it remained for us only to be silent and respect her actions. On the morrow, the queen, with a serious air, but with the greatest kindness, asked what I had said respecting M. de Lafayette on the preceding day, adding that she had been assured I had enjoined her women's silence because they did not like him and that I had taken his part. I repeated what had passed to the queen, word for word. She condescended to tell me that I had done perfectly right. Whenever any false reports respecting me were conveyed to her, she was kind enough to inform me of them, and they had no effect on the confidence with which she continued to honor me, and which I am happy to think I have justified even at the risk of my life. Mesdames, the king's aunts, set out from Bellevue in the beginning of the year 1791. Alexander Berthier, afterwards Prince de Neufchâtel, then a colonel on the staff of the army and commandant of the National Guard of Versailles, facilitated the departure of Mesdames. The Jacobins of that town procured his dismissal, and he ran the greatest risk, on account of having rendered this service to these princesses. I went to take leave of Madame Victoire. I little thought that I was then seeing her for the last time. She received me alone in her closet, and assured me that she hoped, as well as wished, soon to return to France, that the French would be much to be pitied if the excesses of the Revolution should arrive at such a pitch as to force her to prolong her absence. General Berthier justified the monarch's confidence by a firm and prudent line of conduct which entitled him to the highest military honors, and to the esteem of the great warrior whose fortune, dangers, and glory he afterwards shared. This officer, full of honor and gifted with the highest courage, was shut into the courtyard of Bellevue by his own troop, and ran great risk of being murdered. It was not until the 14th of March that he succeeded in executing his instructions, Memoirs of Mesdames, by Montigny, Volume I. I knew from the Queen that the departure of Mesdames was deemed necessary, in order to leave the king free to act when he should be compelled to go away with his family. It being impossible that the constitution of the clergy should be otherwise than in direct opposition to the religious principles of Mesdames, they thought their journey to Rome would be attributed to piety alone. It was, however, difficult to deceive an assembly which weighed the slightest actions of the royal family, and from that moment they were more than ever alive to what was passing at the Tuileries. Mesdames were desirous of taking Madame Elizabeth to Rome. The free exercise of religion, the happiness of taking refuge with the head of the church, and the prospect of living in safety with her aunts, whom she tenderly loved, were sacrificed by that virtuous princess to her attachment to the king. The oath required of priests by the civil constitution of the clergy introduced into France, a division which added to the dangers by which the king was already surrounded. The priests were required to swear to the civil constitution of the clergy of 1790, by which all the former bishoprics and parishes were remodeled, and the priests and bishops elected by the people. Most refused, and under the name of pretres and serments, as opposed to the few who took the oath, pretres serments, were bitterly persecuted. A simple promise to obey the constitution of the state was substituted by Napoleon as soon as he came to power. Murray-Bow spent a whole night with the cure of St. Eustache, confessor of the king and queen, to persuade him to take the oath required by that constitution. Their Majesties chose another confessor, who remained unknown. A few months afterwards, 2d April 1791, the too celebrated Murray-Bow, the mercenary Democrat and venal royalist, terminated his career. The Queen regretted him and was astonished at her own regret, but she had hoped that he who had possessed adroitness and weight enough to throw everything into confusion would have been able by the same means to repair the mischief he had caused. Much has been said respecting the cause of Murray-Bow's death. M. Cabanis, his friend and physician, denied that he was poisoned. M. Vicdazer assured the Queen that the prox-verbal, drawn up on the state of the intestines, would apply just as well to a case of death produced by violent remedies as to one produced by poison. He said also that the report had been faithful, but that it was prudent to conclude it by a declaration of natural death, since, in the critical state in which France then was, if a suspicion of foul play were admitted, a person innocent of any such crime might be sacrificed to public vengeance. Chapter 7. In the beginning of the year 1792, a worthy priest requested a private interview with me. He had learned the existence of a new libel by Madame de Lamotte. He told me that the people who came from London to get it printed in Paris only desired gain, and that they were ready to deliver the manuscript to him for 1,000 louis, if he could find any friend of the Queen disposed to make that sacrifice for her peace. That he had thought of me, and if Her Majesty would give him the 24,000 francs, he would hand the manuscript to me. I communicated this proposal to the Queen, who rejected it, and desired me to answer that at the time when she had power to punish the hawkers of these libels, she deemed them so atrocious and incredible that she despised them too much to stop them. That if she were imprudent and weak enough to buy a single one of them, the Jacobins might possibly discover the circumstance through their espionage. That were this libel brought up, it would be printed nevertheless, and would be much more dangerous when they apprised the public of the means she had used to suppress it. Baron Daubier, gentleman in ordinary to the king, and my particular friend, had a good memory and a clear way of communicating the substance of the debates and decrees of the National Assembly. I went daily to the Queen's apartments to repeat all this to the king, who used to say, on seeing me, "Ah, here's the Postillion par Calais," a newspaper of the time. M. Daubier one day said to me, "The Assembly has been much occupied with an information laid by the workmen of the Sevres manufactory. They brought to the President's office a bundle of pamphlets which they said were the life of Marie Antoinette. The director of the manufactory was ordered up to the bar, and declared he had received orders to burn the printed sheets in question in the furnaces used for baking his china." While I was relating this business to the Queen, the king colored and held his head down over his plate. The Queen said to him, "Do you know anything about this, sire?" The king made no answer. Madame Elizabeth requested him to explain what it meant. Louis was still silent. I withdrew hastily. A few minutes afterwards, the Queen came to my room and informed me that the king, out of regard for her, had purchased the whole edition struck off from the manuscript which I had mentioned to her, and that M. de Laporte had not been able to devise any more secret way of destroying the work than that of having it burnt at Sevres, among 200 workmen, 180 of whom must, in all probability, be Jacobins. She told me she had concealed her vexation from the king, that he was in consternation, and that she could say nothing, since his good intentions and his affection for her had been the cause of the mistake. M. de Laporte had, by order of the king, bought up the whole edition of the Memoirs of the notorious Madame de Lamotte against the Queen. Instead of destroying them immediately, he shut them up in one of the closets in his house. The alarming and rapid growth of the rebellion, the arrogance of the crowd of brigands, who in great measure composed the populace of Paris, and the fresh excesses daily resulting from it, rendered the intendant of the civil list apprehensive that some mob might break into his house, carry off these Memoirs, and spread them among the public. In order to prevent this, he gave orders to have the Memoirs burnt with every necessary precaution, and the clerk who received the order entrusted the execution of it to a man named Riston, a dangerous intriguer, formerly an advocate of Nancy, who had a 12-month before escaped the gallows by favor of the new principles and the patriotism of the new tribunals, although convicted of forging the Great Seal and fabricating decrees of the council. This Riston, finding himself entrusted with a commission which concerned Her Majesty, and the mystery attending which bespoke something of importance, was less anxious to execute it faithfully than to make a parade of this mark of confidence. On the 30th of May, at 10 in the morning, he had the sheets carried to the porcelain manufactory at Sevres, in a cart which he himself accompanied, and made a large fire of them before all the workmen, who were expressly forbidden to approach it. All these precautions, and the suspicions to which they gave rise, under such critical circumstances, gave so much publicity to this affair that it was denounced to the Assembly that very night. Brissot, and the whole Jacobin party, with equal effrontery and vehemence, insisted that the papers thus secretly burnt could be no other than the registers and documents of the correspondence of the Austrian Committee. M. de Laporte was ordered to the bar, and there gave the most precise account of the circumstances. Riston was also called up, and confirmed M. de Laporte's deposition. But these explanations, however satisfactory, did not calm the violent ferment raised in the assembly by this affair. Memoirs of Bertrand de Maleville. Some time afterwards, the assembly received a denunciation against M. de Montmorin. The ex-minister was accused of having neglected 40 dispatches from M. Genet, the charge d'affaires from France in Russia, not having even unsealed them, because M. Genet acted on constitutional principles. M. de Montmorin appeared at the bar to answer this accusation. Whatever distress I might feel in obeying the order I had received from the king to go and give him an account of the sitting, I thought I ought not to fail in doing so. But instead of giving my brother his family name, I merely said, Your Majesty's charge d'affaires at St. Petersburg. The king did me the favor to say that he noticed a reserve in my account, of which he approved. The queen condescended to add a few obliging remarks to those of the king. However, my office of journalist gave me in this instance so much pain that I took an opportunity, when the king was expressing his satisfaction to me at the manner in which I gave him this daily account, to tell him that its merits belonged wholly to M. Daubier, and I ventured to request the king to suffer that excellent man to give him an account of the sittings himself. I assured the king that if he would permit it, that gentleman might proceed to the queen's apartments through mine unseen. The king consented to the arrangement. Thenceforward M. Daubier gave the king repeated proofs of zeal and attachment. The cure of St. Eustache ceased to be the queen's confessor when he took the constitutional oath. I do not remember the name of the ecclesiastic who succeeded him. I only know that he was conducted into her apartments with the greatest mystery. Their Majesties did not perform their Easter devotions in public, because they could neither declare for the constitutional clergy, nor act so as to show that they were against them. The Queen did perform her Easter devotions in 1792, but she went to the chapel attended only by myself. She desired me beforehand to request one of my relations, who was her chaplain, to celebrate a mass for her at 5 o'clock in the morning. It was still dark. She gave me her arm, and I lighted her with a taper. I left her alone at the chapel door. She did not return to her room until the dawn of day. Dangers increased daily. The assembly were strengthened in the eyes of the people by the hostilities of the foreign armies and the army of the princes. The communication with the latter party became more active. The queen wrote almost every day. M. de Gauguelat possessed her confidence for all correspondence with the foreign parties, and I was obliged to have him in my apartments. The queen asked for him very frequently, and at times which she could not previously appoint. All parties were exerting themselves either to ruin or to save the king. One day I found the queen extremely agitated. She told me she no longer knew where she was, that the leaders of the Jacobins offered themselves to her through the medium of Dumouriez, or that Dumouriez, abandoning the Jacobins, had come and offered himself to her, that she had granted him an audience, that when alone with her, he had thrown himself at her feet and told her that he had drawn the bonnet rouge over his head to the very ears, but that he neither was nor could be a Jacobin, that the revolution had been suffered to extend even to that rabble of destroyers who, thinking of nothing but pillage, were ripe for anything, and might furnish the assembly with a formidable army, ready to undermine the remains of a throne already but too much shaken. While speaking with the utmost ardor, he seized the queen's hand and kissed it with transport, exclaiming, "Suffer yourself to be saved." The queen told me that the protestations of a traitor were not to be relied on, that the whole of his conduct was so well known that undoubtedly the wisest course was not to trust to it. That, moreover, the princes particularly recommended that no confidence should be placed in any proposition emanating from within the kingdom, that the force without became imposing, and that it was better to rely upon their success, and upon the protection due from heaven to a sovereign so virtuous as Louis Roman XVI, and to so just a cause. The sincerity of General Dumouriez cannot be doubted in this instance. The second volume of his Memoirs shows how unjust the mistrust and reproaches of the queen were. By rejecting his services, Marie Antoinette deprived herself of her only remaining support. He who saved France in the defiles of Argonne would perhaps have saved France before the 20th of June, had he obtained the full confidence of Louis Roman XVI. And the Queen, note by the editor. The constitutionalists, on their part, saw that there had been nothing more than a pretense of listening to them. Barnave's last advice was as to the means of continuing a few weeks longer. The Constitutional Guard, which had been denounced to the Assembly and was to be disbanded. The denunciation against the Constitutional Guard affected only its staff and the Duc de Brissac. Barnave wrote to the Queen that the staff of the Guard was already attacked, that the Assembly was about to pass a decree to reduce it, and he entreated her to prevail on the King, the very instant the decree should appear, to form the staff afresh of persons whose names he sent her. Barnave said that all who were set down in it passed for decided Jacobins, but were not so in fact, that they, as well as himself, were in despair at seeing the monarchical government attacked, that they had learnt to dissemble their sentiments, and that it would be at least a fortnight before the Assembly could know them well, and certainly before it could succeed in making them unpopular, that it would be necessary to take advantage of that short space of time to get away from Paris, immediately after their nomination. The Queen was of opinion that she ought not to yield to this advice. The Duc de Brissac was sent to Orleans, and the Guard was disbanded. Barnave, seeing that the Queen did not follow his counsel in anything, and convinced that she placed all her reliance on assistance from abroad, determined to quit Paris. He obtained a last audience. "Your misfortunes, Madame," said he, "and those which I anticipate for France, determined me to sacrifice myself to serve you. I see, however, that my advice does not agree with the views of your Majesties. I augur but little advantage from the plan you are induced to pursue. You are too remote from your succors. You will be lost before they reach you. Most ardently do I wish I may be mistaken in so lamentable a prediction, but I am sure to pay with my head for the interest your misfortunes have raised in me and the services I have sought to render you. I request, for my sole reward, the honor of kissing your hand." The Queen, her eyes suffused with tears, granted him that favor, and remained impressed with a favorable idea of his sentiments. Madame Elizabeth participated in this opinion, and the two princesses frequently spoke of Barnave. The Queen also received M. Duport several times, but with less mystery. Her connection with the constitutional deputies transpired. Alexander de Weymouth was the only one of the three who survived the vengeance of the Jacobins. Barnave was arrested at Grenoble. He remained in prison in that town 15 months, and his friends began to hope that he would be forgotten, when an order arrived that he should be removed to Paris. At first, he was imprisoned in the Abbaye, but transferred to the Conciergerie, and almost immediately taken before the Revolutionary Tribunal. He appeared there with wonderful firmness, summed up the services he had rendered to the cause of liberty with his usual eloquence, and made such an impression upon the numerous auditors that, although accustomed to behold only conspirators worthy of death in all those who appeared before the tribunal, they themselves considered his acquittal cert. The decree of death was read amidst the deepest silence, but Barnave's firmness was immovable. When he left the court, he cast upon the judges, the jurors, and the public looks expressive of contempt and indignation. He was led to his fate with the respected Duport du Tertre, one of the last ministers of Louis Roman XVI. When he had ascended the scaffold, Barnave stamped, raised his eyes to heaven, and said, "This, then, is the reward of all that I have done for liberty." He fell on the 29th of October, 1793, in the 32nd year of his age. His bust was placed in the Grenoble Museum. The consular government placed his statue next to that of Vergniaud, on the great staircase of the Palace of the Senate. Biographie de Bruxelles. The National Guard, which succeeded the King's Guard, having occupied the gates of the Tuileries, all who came to see the Queen were insulted with impunity. Menacing cries were uttered aloud even in the Tuileries. They called for the destruction of the throne and the murder of the sovereign. The grossest insults were offered by the very lowest of the mob. About this time, the King fell into a despondent state, which amounted almost to physical helplessness. He passed 10 successive days without uttering a single word, even in the bosom of his family, except, indeed, when playing at backgammon after dinner with Madame Elizabeth. The Queen roused him from this state, so fatal at a critical period, by throwing herself at his feet, urging every alarming idea, and employing every affectionate expression. She represented also what he owed to his family, and told him that if they were doomed to fall they ought to fall honorably, and not wait to be smothered upon the floor of their apartment. About the 15th of June, 1792, The king refused his sanction to the 2 decrees ordaining the deportation of priests and the formation of a camp of 20,000 men under the walls of Paris. He himself wished to sanction them, and said that the general insurrection only waited for a pretense to burst forth. The queen insisted upon the veto, and reproached herself bitterly when this last act of the constitutional authority had occasioned the day of the 20th of June. A few days previously, about 20,000 men had gone to the Commune to announce that, on the 20th, they would plant the tree of liberty at the door of the National Assembly, and present a petition to the king respecting the veto which he had placed upon the decree for the deportation of the priests. This dreadful army crossed the garden of the Tuileries and marched under the queen's windows. It consisted of people who called themselves the citizens of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine and Saint-Marceau. Clothed in filthy rags, they bore a most terrifying appearance and even infected the air. People asked each other where such an army could come from. Nothing so disgusting had ever before appeared in Paris. On the 20th of June, this mob thronged about the Tuileries in still greater numbers, armed with pikes, hatchets, and murderous instruments of all kinds, decorated with ribbons of the national colors, shouting, "The nation forever! Down with the veto!" The king was without guards. Some of these desperadoes rushed up to his apartment. The door was about to be forced in when the king commanded that it should be opened. Messieurs de Bougainville, de Hervely, de Perrois, d'Aubier, Acloque, Gentle, and other courageous men who were in the apartment of M. de Septuel, the king's first valet de chamber, instantly ran to his majesty's apartment. M. de Bougainville, seeing the torrent furiously advancing, cried out, "Put the king in the recess of the window, and place benches before him." 6 royalist grenadiers of the battalion of the Filles St. Thomas made their way by an inner staircase, and ranged themselves before the benches. The order given by M. de Bougainville saved the king from the blades of the assassins, among whom was a Pole named Lazowski, who was to strike the first blow. The king's brave defenders said, "Sire, fear nothing." The king's reply is well known, "Put your hand upon my heart, and you will perceive whether I am afraid." M. Vanot, commandant of battalion, warded off a blow aimed by a wretch against the king. A grenadier of the Filles St. Thomas parried a sword thrust made in the same direction. Madame Elizabeth ran to her brother's apartments. When she reached the door, she heard loud threats of death against the queen. They called for the head of the Austrian. "Ah, let them think I am the queen," she said to those around her, "that she may have time to escape." The queen could not join the king. She was in the council chamber, where she had been placed behind the great table to protect her, as much as possible, against the approach of the barbarians. Preserving a noble and becoming demeanor in this dreadful situation, she held the Dauphin before her, seated upon the table. Madame was at her side. The Princess de Lamballe, the Princess de Tarrant, Madame de la Rocheyman, Madame de Tourzel, and Madame de Macau surrounded her. She had fixed a tricolored cockade, which one of the National Guard had given her, upon her head. The poor little Dauphin was, like the king, shrouded in an enormous red cap. One of the circumstances of the 20th of June, which most vexed the king's friends, being that of his wearing the bonnet rouge nearly 3 hours, I ventured to ask him for some explanation of a fact so strikingly in contrast with the extraordinary intrepidity shown by His Majesty during that horrible day. This was his answer: "The cries of the nation forever." Violently increasing around me, and seeming to be addressed to me, I replied that the nation had not a warmer friend than myself. Upon this, an ill-looking man, making his way through the crowd, came up to me and said, rather roughly, "Well, if you speak the truth, prove it by putting on this red cap." "I consent," replied I. 1 or 2 of them immediately came forward and placed the cap upon my hair, for it was too small for my head. I was convinced, I knew not why, that his intention was merely to place the cap upon my head for a moment, and then to take it off again, and I was so completely taken up with what was passing before me that I did not feel whether the cap did or did not remain upon my hair. I was so little aware of it that when I returned to my room I knew only from being told, so that it was still there. I was very much surprised to find it upon my head, and was the more vexed at it because I might have taken it off immediately without the smallest difficulty. But I am satisfied that if I had hesitated to consent to its being placed upon my head, the drunken fellow who offered it to me would have thrust his pike into my stomach. Memoirs of Bertrand de Malville. The horde passed in files before the table. The sort of standards which they carried were symbols of the most atrocious barbarity. There was one representing a gibbet, to which a dirty doll was suspended, The words Marie Antoinette a la lantern were written beneath it. Another was a board, to which a bullock's heart was fastened, with heart of Louis Roman XVI, written round it, and a third showed the horn of an ox with an obscene inscription. One of the most furious Jacobin women who marched with these wretches stopped to give vent to 1,000 imprecations against the Queen. Her Majesty asked whether she had ever seen her. She replied that she had not. Whether she had done her any personal wrong, her answer was the same, but she added, "It is you who have caused the misery of the nation." "You have been told so," answered the Queen. "You are deceived. As the wife of the King of France and mother of the Dauphin, I am a Frenchwoman. I shall never see my own country again. I can be happy or unhappy only in France. I was happy when you loved me." The Fury began to weep, asked her pardon, and said, "It was because I did not know you. I see that you are good." Santerre, the monarch of the Faubourgs, made his subjects file off as quickly as he could, and it was thought at the time that he was ignorant of the object of this insurrection, which was the murder of the royal family. However, it was 8 o'clock in the evening before the palace was completely cleared. 12 deputies, impelled by attachment to the king's person, ranged themselves near him at the commencement of the insurrection. But the deputation from the assembly did not reach the Tuileries until 6 in the evening. All the doors of the apartments were broken. The Queen pointed out to the deputies the state of the king's palace, and the disgraceful manner in which his asylum had been violated under the very eyes of the assembly. She saw that Merlin de Thionville was so much affected as to shed tears while she spoke. "You weep, M. Merlin," said she to him, "at seeing the king and his family so cruelly treated by a people whom he always wished to make happy." "True, madame," replied Merlin. "I weep for the misfortunes of a beautiful and feeling woman, the mother of a family. But do not mistake, not one of my tears falls for either king or queen. I hate kings and queens, it is my religion." The Queen could not appreciate this madness, and saw all that was to be apprehended by persons who evinced it. All hope was gone, and nothing was thought of but succor from abroad. The Queen appealed to her family and the king's brothers. Her letters probably became more pressing, and expressed apprehensions upon the tardiness of relief. Her Majesty read me one to herself from the Archduchess Christina, gouvernante of the Low Countries. She reproached the Queen for some of her expressions, and told her that those out of France were at least as much alarmed as herself at the king's situation and her own, but that the manner of attempting to assist her might either save her or endanger her safety, and that the members of the coalition were bound to act prudently, entrusted as they were with interests so dear to them. The 14th of July, 1792, fixed by the Constitution as the anniversary of the independence of the nation, drew near. The King and Queen were compelled to make their appearance on the occasion, aware that the plot of the 20th of June had their assassination for its object. They had no doubt but that their death was determined on for the day of this national festival. The Queen was recommended, in order to give the king's friends time to defend him if the attack should be made, to guard him against the first stroke of a dagger by making him wear a breastplate. I was directed to get one made in my apartments. It was composed of 15 folds of Italian taffety and formed into an under waistcoat and a wide belt. This breastplate was tried. It resisted all thrusts of the dagger, and several balls were turned aside by it. When it was completed, the difficulty was to let the king try it on without running the risk of being surprised. I wore the immense heavy waistcoat as an under petticoat for 3 days without being able to find a favorable moment. At length, the king found an opportunity one morning to pull off his coat in the Queen's chamber and try on the breastplate. The Queen was in bed. The king pulled me gently by the gown and drew me as far as he could from the Queen's bed and said to me in a very low tone of voice, "It is to satisfy her that I submit to this inconvenience. They will not assassinate me. Their scheme is changed. They will put me to death another way." The Queen heard the king whispering to me, and when he was gone out, she asked me what he had said. I hesitated to answer. She insisted that I should, saying that nothing must be concealed from her, and that she was resigned upon every point. When she was informed of the king's remark, she told me she had guessed it, that he had long since observed to her that all which was going forward in France was an imitation of the revolution in England in the time of Charles I, and that he was incessantly reading the history of that unfortunate monarch in order that he might act better than Charles had done at a similar crisis. I begin to be fearful of the king's being brought to trial, continued the queen. As to me, I am a foreigner. They will assassinate me. What will become of my poor children? These sad ejaculations were followed by a torrent of tears. I wished to give her an antispasmodic. She refused it, saying that only happy women could feel nervous, that the cruel situation to which she was reduced rendered these remedies useless. In fact, the queen, who during her happier days was frequently attacked by hysterical disorders, enjoyed more uniform health when all the faculties of her soul were called forth to support her physical strength. I had prepared a corset for her for the same purpose as the king's under waistcoat without her knowledge, but she would not make use of it. All my entreaties, all my tears were in vain. If the factions assassinate me, she replied, it will be a fortunate event for me. They will deliver me from a most painful existence. A few days after the king had tried on his breastplate, I met him on a back staircase. I drew back to let him pass. He stopped and took my hand. I wished to kiss his. He would not suffer it, but drew me towards him by the hand and kissed both my cheeks without saying a single word. The fear of another attack upon the Tuileries occasioned scrupulous search among the king's papers. I burnt almost all those belonging to the queen. She put her family letters, a great deal of correspondence which she thought it necessary to preserve for the history of the era of the Revolution, and particularly Barnave's letters and her answers, of which she had copies, into a portfolio, which she entrusted to M. de J. That gentleman was unable to save this deposit, and it was burnt. The queen left a few papers in her secretaire. Among them were instructions to Madame de Tourzel, respecting the dispositions of her children and the characters and abilities of the sub-governesses under that lady's orders. This paper, which the queen drew up at the time of Madame de Tourzel's appointment, with several letters from Maria Theresa, filled with the best advice and instructions, was printed after the 10th of August by order of the Assembly in the collection of papers found in the secretaires of the King and Queen. Her Majesty had still, without reckoning the income of the month, 140,000 francs in gold. She was desirous of depositing the whole of it with me, but I advised her to retain 1,500 louis, as a sum of rather considerable amount might be suddenly necessary for her. The king had an immense quantity of papers, and unfortunately conceived the idea of privately making, with the assistance of a locksmith who had worked with him above 10 years, a place of concealment in an inner corridor of his apartments. The place of concealment, but for the man's information, would have been long undiscovered. The wall in which it was made was painted to imitate large stones, and the opening was entirely concealed among the brown grooves which formed the shaded part of these painted stones. But even before this, locksmith had denounced what was afterwards called the iron closet to the Assembly. The queen was aware that he had talked of it to some of his friends, and that this man, in whom the king from long habit placed too much confidence, was a Jacobin. She warned the king of it, and prevailed on him to fill a very large portfolio with all the papers he was most interested in preserving, and entrust it to me. She entreated him in my presence to leave nothing in this closet, and the king, in order to quiet her, told her that he had left nothing there. I would have taken the portfolio and carried it to my apartment, but it was too heavy for me to lift. The king said he would carry it himself. I went before to open the doors for him. When he placed the portfolio in my inner closet, he merely said, "The queen will tell you what it contains." Upon my return to the queen, I put the question to her, deeming, from what the king had said, that it was necessary I should know. "They are," the queen answered me, "such documents as would be most dangerous to the king should they go so far as to proceed to a trial against him. But what he wishes me to tell you is, that the portfolio contains a prox-verbal of a cabinet council, in which the king gave his opinion against the war. He had it signed by all the ministers, and in case of a trial, he trusts that this document will be very useful to him." I asked the queen to whom she thought I ought to commit the portfolio. "To whom you please," answered she. "You alone are answerable for it. Do not quit the palace even during your vacation months. There may be circumstances under which it would be very desirable that we should be able to have it instantly." At this period, M. de Lafayette, who had probably given up the idea of establishing a republic in France similar to that of the United States, and was desirous to support the first constitution which he had sworn to defend, quitted his army, and came to the assembly for the purpose of supporting by his presence, and by an energetic speech, a petition signed by 20,000 citizens against the late violation of the residence of the king and his family. The general found the constitutional party powerless and saw that he himself had lost his popularity. The assembly disapproved of the step he had taken. The king, for whom it was taken, showed no satisfaction at it, and he saw himself compelled to return to his army as quickly as he could. He thought he could rely on the National Guard, but on the day of his arrival, those officers who were in the king's interest inquired of His Majesty whether they were to forward the views of General de Lafayette by joining him in such measures as he should pursue during his stay at Paris. The king enjoined them not to do so. From this answer, M. de Lafayette perceived that he was abandoned by the remainder of his party in the Paris Guard. On his arrival, a plan was presented to the Queen, in which it was proposed by a junction between Lafayette's army and the king's party to rescue the royal family and convey them to Rouen. I did not learn the particulars of this plan. The Queen only said to me upon the subject that M. de Lafayette was offered to them as a resource, but that it would be better for them to perish than to owe their safety to the man who had done them the most mischief, or to place themselves under the necessity of treating with him. I passed the whole month of July without going to bed. I was fearful of some attack by night. There was one plot against the Queen's life which has never been made known. I was alone by her bedside at 1 o'clock in the morning. We heard somebody walking softly down the corridor, which passes along the whole line of her apartments, and which was then locked at each end. I went out to fetch the valet de chambre. He entered the corridor, and the Queen and myself soon heard the noise of two men fighting. The unfortunate princess held me locked in her arms and said to me, "What a situation! Insults by day and assassins by night." The valet de chambre cried out to her from the corridor, "Madame, it is a wretch that I know. I have him." "Let him go," said the Queen. "Open the door to him. He came to murder me. The Jacobins would carry him about in triumph tomorrow." The man was a servant of the king's toilet, who had taken the key of the corridor out of His Majesty's pocket after he was in bed, no doubt with the intention of committing the crime suspected. The valet de chambre, who was a very strong man, held him by the wrists and thrust him out at the door. The wretch did not speak a word. The valet de chambre said, in answer to the Queen, who spoke to him gratefully of the danger to which he had exposed himself, that he feared nothing, and that he had always a pair of excellent pistols about him for no other purpose than to defend Her Majesty. The next day M. de Septuil had all the locks of the king's inner apartments changed. I did the same by those of the Queen. We were every moment told that the Faubourg Saint-Antoine was preparing to march against the palace. At 4 o'clock one morning towards the latter end of July, a person came to give me information to that effect. I instantly sent off 2 men, on whom I could rely, with orders to proceed to the usual places for assembling, and to come back speedily and give me an account of the state of the city. We knew that at least an hour must elapse before the populace or the faubourgs assembled on the site of the Bastille could reach the Tuileries. It seemed to me sufficient for the Queen's safety that all about her should be awakened. I went softly into her room. She was asleep. I did not awaken her. I found General de W in the great closet. He told me the meeting was, for this once, dispersing. The general had endeavored to please the populace by the same means as M. de Lafayette had employed. He saluted the lowest poissard and lowered his hat down to his very stirrup. But the populace, who had been flattered for 3 years, required far different homage to its power, and the poor man was unnoticed. The king had been awakened, and so had Madame Elizabeth, who had gone to him. The Queen, yielding to the weight of her griefs, slept till 9 o'clock on that day, which was very unusual with her. The king had already been to know whether she was awake. I told him what I had done, and the care I had taken not to disturb her. He thanked me and said, "I was awake, and so was the whole palace. She ran no risk. I am very glad to see her take a little rest. Alas, her griefs double mine." What was my chagrin when, upon awaking and learning what had passed, the Queen burst into tears from regret at not having been called, and began to upbraid me, on whose friendship she ought to have been able to rely, for having served her so ill under such circumstances. In vain did I reiterate that it had been only a false alarm, and that she required to have her strength recruited. "It is not diminished," said she. "Misfortune gives us additional strength." Elizabeth was with the king, and I was a sleepy who am determined to perish by his side. I am his wife. I will not suffer him to incur the smallest risk without my sharing it. Trial of the king parting, of the royal family execution. The crowd was immense as, on the morning of the 11th December, 1792, Louis Roman XVI was driven slowly from the Temple to the Convention, escorted by cavalry, infantry, and artillery. Paris looked like an armed camp. All the posts were doubled. The muster roll of the National Guard was called over every hour. A picket of 200 men watched in the court of each of the right sections. A reserve with cannon was stationed at the Tuileries, and strong detachments patrolled the streets and cleared the road of all loiterers. The trees that lined the boulevards, the doors and windows of the houses, were alive with gazers, and all eyes were fixed on the king. He was much changed since his people last beheld him. The beard he had been compelled to grow after his razors were taken from him covered cheeks, lips, and chin with light-colored hair, which concealed the melancholy expression of his mouth. He had become thin, and his garments hung loosely on him. But his manner was perfectly collected and calm, and he recognized and named to the mayor the various quarters through which he passed. On arriving at the Feuillants, he was taken to a room to await the orders of the assembly. It was about 2:30 when the king appeared at the bar. The mayor and Generoc Santera and Whittingoff were at his side. Profound silence pervaded the assembly. All were touched by the king's dignity and the composure of his looks under so great a reverse of fortune. By nature, he had been formed rather to endure calamity with patience than to contend against it with energy. The approach of death could not disturb his serenity. "Louis, you may be seated," said Barra. "Answer the questions that shall be put to you." The king seated himself and listened to the reading of the Acti Annunciative, article by article. All the faults of the court were there enumerated and imputed to Louis Roman XVI, personally. He was charged with the interruption of the sittings of the 20th of June, 1789, with the bed of justice held on the 23d of the same month, the aristocratic conspiracy thwarted by the insurrection of the 14th of July, the entertainment of the Life Guards, the insults offered to the national cockade, the refusal to sanction the Declaration of Rights, as well as several constitutional articles. Lastly, all the facts which indicated a new conspiracy in October, and which were followed by the scenes of the 5th and 6th, the speeches of reconciliation which had succeeded all these scenes, and which promised a change that was not sincere, the false oath taken at the Federation of the 14th of July, the secret practices of Talon and Murraybow to effect a counter-revolution, the money spent in bribing a great number of deputies, the assemblage of the Knights of the Dagger on the 28th of February, 1791, the flight to Varennes, the fusillade of the Champ de Mars, the silence observed respecting the Treaty of Pillnitz, the delay in the promulgation of the decree which incorporated Avignon with France, the commotions at Nimes, Montauban, Mendy, and jails, the continuance of their pay to the emigrant Life Guards and to the disbanded Constitutional Guard, the insufficiency of the armies assembled on the frontiers, the refusal to sanction the decree for the camp of 20,000 men, the disarming of the fortresses, the organization of secret societies in the interior of Paris, the review of the Swiss and the garrison of the palace on the 10th August, the summoning the mayor to the Tuileries, and lastly, the effusion of blood which had resulted from these military dispositions. After each article the president paused and said, "What have you to answer?" The king, in a firm voice, denied some of the facts, imputed others to his ministers, and always appealed to the Constitution, from which he declared he had never deviated. His answers were very temperate, but on the charge, "You spilt the blood of the people on the 10th of August," he exclaimed with emphasis, "No, monsieur, no, it was not I." All the papers on which the act of accusation was founded were then shown to the king, and he disavowed some of them and disputed the existence of the iron chest. This produced a bad impression and was worse than useless, as the fact had been proved. A secret closet which the king had directed to be constructed in a wall in the Tuileries. The door was of iron, whence it was afterwards known by the name of the iron chest. See Thiers and Scott. Throughout the examination, the king showed great presence of mind. He was careful in his answers never to implicate any members of the constituent and legislative assemblies, Many who then sat as his judges trembled lest he should betray them. The Jacobins beheld with dismay the profound impression made on the convention by the firm but mild demeanor of the sovereign. The most violent of the party proposed that he should be hanged that very night. A laugh as of demons followed the proposal from the benches of the mountain, but the majority, composed of the girondists and the neutrals, decided that he should be formally tried. After the examination, Santerre took the king by the arm and led him back to the waiting room of the convention, accompanied by Chambon and Chaumette. Mental agitation and the length of the proceedings had exhausted him, and he staggered from weakness. Chaumette inquired if he wished for refreshment, but the king refused it. A moment after, seeing a grenadier of the escort offer the procureur de la commune half a small loaf, Louis Roman XVI approached and asked him, in a whisper, for a piece. "Ask aloud for what you want," said Chaumette, retreating as though he feared being suspected of pity. "I asked for a piece of your bread," replied the king. "Divide it with me," said Chaumette. "It is a Spartan breakfast. If I had a root, I would give you half." Lamartine's History of the Girondists, edit. 1870, volume Roman II, p. 313. Soon after 6 in the evening, the king returned to the temple. "He seemed tired," says Clary simply, and his first wish was to be led to his family. The officers refused, on the plea that they had no orders. He insisted that at least they should be informed of his return, and this was promised him. "The king ordered me to ask for his supper at 8:30. The intervening hours he employed in his usual reading, surrounded by 4 municipals. When I announced that supper was served, the king asked the commissaries if his family could not come down. They made no reply. But at least, the king said, my son will pass the night in my room, his bed being here." The same silence. After supper, the king again urged his wish to see his family. They answered that they must await the decision of the convention. While I was undressing him, the king said, I was far from expecting all the questions they put to me. He lay down with perfect calmness. The order for my removal during the night was not executed. On the king's return to the temple being known, my mother asked to see him instantly, writes Madame Réal. She made the same request even to Chambon, but received no answer. My brother passed the night with her, and as he had no bed, she gave him hers and sat up all the night in such deep affliction that we were afraid to leave her, but she compelled my aunt and me to go to bed. Next day she again asked to see my father and to read the newspapers, that she might learn the course of the trial. She entreated that if she was to be denied this indulgence, his children, at least, might see him. Her requests were referred to the commune. The newspapers were refused, but my brother and I were to be allowed to see my father on condition of being entirely separated from my mother. My father replied that, great as his happiness was in seeing his children, the important business which then occupied him would not allow of his attending altogether to his son, and that his daughter could not leave her mother. During their last interview, Madame Elizabeth had given Clary one of her handkerchiefs, saying, "You shall keep it so long as my brother continues well. If he becomes ill, send it to me among my nephew's things." The Assembly having, after a violent debate, resolved that Louis Roman XVI should have the aid of counsel, a deputation was sent to the temple to ask whom he would choose. The king named Messieurs Target and Tronchet. The former refused his services on the ground that he had discontinued practice since 1785. The latter complied at once with the king's request. And while the Assembly was considering whom to nominate in Target's place, the president received a letter from the venerable Malesherbes, then 70 years old and the most respected magistrate in France, in the course of which he said, "I have been twice called to be counsel for him who was my master, in times when that duty was coveted by everyone. I owe him the same service now that it is a duty which many people deem dangerous. If I knew any possible means of acquainting him with my desires, I should not take the liberty of addressing myself to you." Christian Guillaume de Lamartine de Malesherbes, an eminent French statesman, son of the Chancellor of France, was born at Paris in 1721. In 1750, he succeeded his father as president of the Court of Aids and was also made superintendent of the press. On the banishment of the parliaments and the suppression of the Court of Aids, Malesherbes was exiled to his country seat. In 1775, he was appointed Minister of State. On the decree of the Convention for the King's trial, he emerged from his retreat to become the voluntary advocate of his sovereign. Maelscherbes was guillotined in 1794, and almost his whole family were extirpated by their merciless persecutors. Other citizens made similar proposals, but the king, being made acquainted with them by a deputation from the commune, while expressing his gratitude for all the offers, accepted only that of Maelscherbes. The citoyenne Olympia de Ganges, calling herself a free and loyal republican without spot or blame, and declaring that the cold and selfish cruelty of Target had inflamed her heroism and roused her sensibility, asked permission to assist M. de Maelscherbes in defending the king. The assembly passed to the order of the day on this request. Bertrand de Malville, Annals, edit. 1802, Vol. Roman 8, p. 254. On 14th December, M. Tronchet was allowed to confer with the king, and later in the same day M. de Maelscherbes was admitted to the Tower. The king ran up to this worthy old man, whom he clasped in his arms, said Clary, and the former minister melted into tears at the sight of his master. According to M. de Hugh, the first time M. de Maelscherbes entered the temple, the king clasped him in his arms and said, "Ah, is it you, my friend? You fear not to endanger your own life to save mine, but all will be useless. They will bring me to the scaffold. No matter, I shall gain my cause if I leave an unspotted memory behind me." Another deputation brought the king the act of accusation and the documents relating to it, numbering more than 100, and taking from 4 o'clock till midnight to read. During this long process, the king had refreshments served to the deputies, taking nothing himself till they had left, but considerately reproving Clary for not having supped. From the 14th to the 26th December, the king saw his council and their colleague M. de Size every day. At this time, a means of communication between the royal family and the king was devised. A man named Turgi, who had been in the royal kitchen, and who contrived to obtain employment in the temple, when conveying the meals of the royal family to their apartments or articles he had purchased for them, managed to give Madame Elizabeth news of the king. Next day, the princess, when Turgi was removing the dinner, slipped into his hand a bit of paper on which she had pricked with a pin a request for a word from her brother's own hand. Turgi gave this paper to Clary, who conveyed it to the king the same evening, and he, being allowed writing materials while preparing his defense, wrote Madame Elizabeth a short note. An answer was conveyed in a ball of cotton, which Turgi threw under Clary's bed while passing the door of his room. Letters were also passed between the princess's room and that of Clary, who lodged beneath her, by means of a string let down and drawn up at night. This communication with his family was a great comfort to the king, who nevertheless constantly cautioned his faithful servant. "Take care," he would say kindly, "you expose yourself too much." The king's natural benevolence was constantly shown while in the temple. His own dreadful position never prevented him from sympathy with the smaller troubles of others. A servant in the temple named Marchand, the father of a family, was robbed of 200 francs his wages for 2 months. The king observed his distress, asked its cause, and gave Clary the amount to be handed to Marchand, with a caution not to speak of it to anyone, and above all not to thank the king, lest it should injure him with his employers. During his separation from his family, the king refused to go into the garden. When it was proposed to him, he said, "I cannot make up my mind to go out alone. The walk was agreeable to me only when I shared it with my family." But he did not allow himself to dwell on painful reflections. He talked freely to the municipals on guard, and surprised them by his varied and practical knowledge of their trades and his interest in their domestic affairs. On the 19th December, the king's breakfast was served as usual, but being a fast day, he refused to take anything. At dinner time, the king said to Clary, "14 years ago you were up earlier than you were today. It is the day my daughter was born today, her birthday," he repeated, with tears, "and to be prevented from seeing her." Madame Royale had wished for a calendar. The king ordered Clary to buy her the Almanac of the Republic, which had replaced the court almanac, and ran through it, marking with a pencil many names. "On Christmas Day," says Clary, "the king wrote his will." Madame Royale says, "On the 26th December, St. Stephen's Day, my father made his will because he expected to be assassinated that day on his way to the bar of the convention. He went thither, nevertheless, with his usual calmness." Royal Memoirs, p. 196. On the 26th December, 1792, the king appeared a second time before the convention. M. Decize, laboring night and day, had completed his defense. The king insisted on excluding from it all that was too rhetorical and confining it to the mere discussion of essential points. When the pathetic peroration of M. Decize was read to the king the evening before it was delivered to the assembly, "I have to request of you," he said, "to make a painful sacrifice. Strike out of your pleading the peroration. It is enough for me to appear before such judges and show my entire innocence. I will not move their feelings." Lacretelle. At 9:30 in the morning, the whole armed force was in motion to conduct him from the temple to the Feuillants, with the same precautions and in the same order as had been observed on the former occasion. Riding in the carriage of the mayor, he conversed, on the way, with the same composure as usual, and talked of Seneca, of Livy, of the hospitals. Arrived at the Feuillants, he showed great anxiety for his defenders. He seated himself beside them in the assembly, surveyed with great composure the benches where his accusers and his judges sat, seemed to examine their faces with the view of discovering the impression produced by the pleading of M. Decize, and more than once conversed smilingly with Tronchet and Malesherbes. The assembly received his defense in sullen silence, but without any tokens of disapprobation. Being afterwards conducted to an adjoining room with his counsel, the king showed great anxiety about M. Decize, who seemed fatigued by the long defense. While riding back to the temple, he conversed with his companions with the same serenity as he had shown on leaving it. No sooner had the king left the hall of the convention than a violent tumult arose there. Some were for opening the discussion. Others, complaining of the delays which postponed the decision of this process, demanded the vote immediately, remarking that in every court, after the accused had been heard, the judges proceed to give their opinion. Lanjuinais had from the commencement of the proceedings felt an indignation which his impetuous disposition no longer suffered him to repress. He darted to the tribune, and, amidst the cries excited by his presence, demanded the annulling of the proceedings altogether. He exclaimed that the days of ferocious men were gone by, that the assembly ought not to be so dishonored as to be made to sit in judgment on Louis Roman XVI. That no authority in France had that right, and the assembly in particular had no claim to it, that if it resolved to act as a political body, it could do no more than take measures of safety against the sight of Ant King, but that if it was acting as a court of justice, it was overstepping all principles, for it was subjecting the vanquished to be tried by the conquerors, since most of the present members had declared themselves the conspirators of the 10th of August. At the word conspirators, a tremendous uproar arose on all aides. Cries of order, to the abbé, down with the tribune, were heard. Lanjuinais strove in vain to justify the word conspirators, saying that he meant it to be taken in a favorable sense, and that the 10th of August was a glorious conspiracy. He concluded by declaring that he would rather die 1,000 deaths than condemn, contrary to all laws, even the most execrable of tyrants. A great number of speakers followed, and the confusion continually increased. The members, determined not to hear any more, mingled together, formed groups, abused and threatened one another. After a tempest of an hour's duration, tranquility was at last restored, and the assembly, adopting the opinion of those who demanded the discussion on the trial of Louis Roman XVI, declared that it was opened and that it should be continued to the exclusion of all other business, till sentence should be passed. The discussion was accordingly resumed on the 27th, and there was a constant succession of speakers from the 28th to the 31st. Vergniaud at length ascended the tribune for the first time, and an extraordinary eagerness was manifested to hear the Girondists express their sentiments by the lips of their greatest orator. The speech of Vergniaud produced a deep impression on all his hearers. Robespierre was thunderstruck by his earnest and persuasive eloquence. Vergniaud, however, had but shaken, not convinced, the assembly, which wavered between the two parties. Several members were successively heard for and against the appeal to the people. Brissot, Genson, Pétion supported it in their turn. One speaker at length had a decisive influence on the question. Barras, by his suppleness and his cold and evasive eloquence, was the model and oracle of the centre. He spoke at great length on the trial, reviewed it in all its bearings of facts, of laws, and of policy, and furnished all those weak minds, who only wanted specious reasons for yielding, with motives for the condemnation of the king. From that moment, the unfortunate king was condemned. The discussion lasted till the 7th, and nobody would listen any longer to the continual repetition of the same facts and arguments. It was therefore declared to be closed without opposition, but the proposal of a fresh adjournment excited a commotion among the most violent, and ended in a decree which fixed the 14th of January for putting the questions to the vote. Meantime, the king did not allow the torturing suspense to disturb his outward composure, or lessen his kindness to those around him. On the morning after his second appearance at the bar of the convention, the commissary Vincent, who had undertaken secretly to convey to the queen a copy of the king's printed defense, asked for something which had belonged to him to treasure as a relic. The king took off his neck handkerchief and gave it him. His gloves he bestowed on another municipal, who had made the same request. On January 1st, says Clary, I approached the king's bed and asked permission to offer him my warmest prayers for the end of his misfortunes. I accept your good wishes with affection, he replied, extending his hand to me. As soon as he had risen, he requested a municipal to go and inquire for his family and present them his good wishes for the new year. The officers were moved by the tone in which these words, so heartrending considering the position of the king, were pronounced. The correspondence between their majesties went on constantly. The king, being informed that Madame Royale was ill, was very uneasy for some days. The queen, after begging earnestly, obtained permission for M. Brunier, the medical attendant of the royal children, to come to the temple. This seemed to quiet him. The nearer the moment which was to decide the king's fate approached, the greater became the agitation in Paris. A report was circulated that the atrocities of September were to be repeated there, and the prisoners and their relatives beset the deputies with supplications that they would snatch them from destruction. The Jacobins, on their part, alleged that conspiracies were hatching in all quarters to save Louis Roman XVI from punishment and to restore royalty. Their anger, excited by delays and obstacles, assumed a more threatening aspect, and the two parties thus alarmed one another by supposing that each harbored sinister designs. On the 14th of January, the convention called for the order of the day, being the final judgment of Louis Roman XVI. The sitting of the convention which concluded the trial, says Hazlitt, lasted 72 hours. It might naturally be supposed that silence, restraint, a sort of religious awe would have pervaded the scene. On the contrary, everything bore the marks of gaiety, dissipation, and the most grotesque confusion. The farther end of the hall was converted into boxes, where ladies, in a studied déshabille, swallowed ices, oranges, liqueurs, and received the salutations of the members who went and came, as on ordinary occasions. Here the doorkeepers on the mountainside opened and shut the boxes reserved for the mistresses of the Duc d'Orléans. And there, though every sound of approbation or disapprobation was strictly forbidden, you heard the long and indignant ha-has of the Mother Duchess, the patroness of the bands of female Jacobins, whenever her ears were not loudly greeted with the welcome sounds of death. The upper gallery, reserved for the people, was during the whole trial constantly full of strangers of every description, drinking wine as in a tavern. Bets were made as to the issue of the trial in all the neighboring coffee-houses. Ennui, impatience, disgust sat on almost every countenance. The figures passing and repassing, rendered more ghastly by the pallid lights, and who in a slow, sepulchral voice pronounced only the word death, others calculating if they should have time to go to dinner before they gave their verdict. Women pricking cards with pins in order to count the votes. Some of the deputies fallen asleep, and only waking up to give their sentence all, this had the appearance rather of a hideous dream than of a reality. The Duc d'Orléans, when called on to give his vote for the death of his king and relation, walked with a faltering step, and a face paler than death itself, to the appointed place, and there read these words: "Exclusively governed by my duty, and convinced that all those who have resisted the sovereignty of the people deserve death, my vote is for death." Important as the accession of the first prince of the blood was to the terrorist faction, his conduct in this instance was too obviously selfish and atrocious not to excite a general feeling of indignation. The agitation of the assembly became extreme. It seemed as if by this single vote the fate of the monarch was irrevocably sealed. The president having examined the register, the result of the scrutiny was proclaimed as follows: against an appeal to the people, 480 for an appeal to the people, 283. Majority for final judgment, 197. The president having announced that he was about to declare the result of the scrutiny, a profound silence ensued, and he then gave in the following declaration: that out of 719 votes, 366 were for death, 319 were for imprisonment during the war, 2 for perpetual imprisonment, 8 for a suspension of the execution of the sentence of death until after the expulsion of the family of the Bourbons, 23 were for not putting him to death until the French territory was invaded by any foreign power, and 1 was for a sentence of death, but with power of commutation of the punishment. After this enumeration, the president took off his hat and, lowering his voice, said, "In consequence of this expression of opinion, I declare that the punishment pronounced by the National Convention against Louis Capet is death." Previous to the passing of the sentence, the president announced on the part of the foreign minister the receipt of a letter from the Spanish minister relative to that sentence. The convention, however, refused to hear it. It will be remembered that a similar remonstrance was forwarded by the English government. M. de Malesherbes, according to his promise to the king, went to the temple at 9 o'clock on the morning of the 17th. Louis was fully prepared for his fate. During the calling of the votes, he asked M. de Malesherbes, "Have you not met near the temple the White Lady?" "What do you mean?" replied he. "Do you not know," resumed the king with a smile, "that when a prince of our house is about to die, a female dressed in white is seen wandering about the palace? My friends," added he to his defenders, "I am about to depart before you for the land of the just, but there, at least, we shall be reunited." In fact, His Majesty's only apprehension seemed to be for his family, Alison. "All is lost," he said to Clary. "The king is condemned." The king, who saw him arrive, rose to receive him. When M. de Malesherbes went to the temple to announce the result of the vote, he found Louis with his forehead resting on his hands and absorbed in a deep reverie. Without inquiring concerning his fate, he said, "For 2 hours I have been considering whether, during my whole reign, I have voluntarily given any cause of complaint to my subjects, and with perfect sincerity I declare that I deserve no reproach at their hands, and that I have never formed a wish but for their happiness." Lacretelle. M. de Malesherbes, choked by sobs, threw himself at his feet. The king raised him up and affectionately embraced him. When he could control his voice, de Malesherbes informed the king of the decree sentencing him to death. He made no movement of surprise or emotion, but seemed only affected by the distress of his advocate, whom he tried to comfort. On the 20th of January, at 2 in the afternoon, Louis Roman XVI was awaiting his advocates when he heard the approach of a numerous party. He stopped with dignity at the door of his apartment, apparently unmoved. Garrett then told him sorrowfully that he was commissioned to communicate to him the decrees of the convention. Grouvel, secretary of the Executive Council, read them to him. The first declared Louis Roman XVI guilty of treason against the general safety of the state. The second condemned him to death. The third rejected any appeal to the people, and the fourth and last ordered his execution in 24 hours. Louis, looking calmly round, took the paper from Grouvel and read Garrett a letter in which he demanded from the convention 3 days to prepare for death, a confessor to assist him in his last moments, liberty to see his family, and permission for them to leave France. Garrett took the letter, promising to submit it immediately to the convention. Louis Roman XVI then went back into his room with great composure, ordered his dinner, and ate as usual. There were no knives on the table, and his attendants refused to let him have any. "Do they think me so cowardly," he exclaimed, "as to lay violent hands on myself? I am innocent, and I am not afraid to die." The convention refused the delay, but granted some other demands which he had made. Garrett sent for Edgeworth de Fermont, the ecclesiastic whom Louis Roman XVI had chosen, and took him in his own carriage to the temple. Edgeworth, on being ushered into the presence of the king, would have thrown himself at his feet, but Louis instantly raised him, and both shed tears of emotion. He then, with eager curiosity, asked various questions concerning the clergy of France, several bishops, and particularly the Archbishop of Paris, requesting him to assure the latter that he died faithfully attached to his communion, the clock having struck 8. He rose, begged Edgeworth to wait, and retired with emotion, saying that he was going to see his family. The municipal officers, unwilling to lose sight of the king, even while with his family, had decided that he should see them in the dining room, which had a glass door, through which they could watch all his motions without hearing what he said. At 8:30 the door opened. The queen, holding the dauphin by the hand, Madame Elizabeth and Madame Royale rushed sobbing into the arms of Louis Roman XVI. The door was closed, and the municipal officers, Clery and M. Edgeworth, placed themselves behind it. During the first moments, it was but a scene of confusion and despair. Cries and lamentations prevented those who were on the watch from distinguishing anything. At length the conversation became more calm, and the princesses, still holding the king clasped in their arms, spoke with him in a low tone. "He related his trial to my mother," says Madame Royale, apologizing for the wretches who had condemned him. "He told her that he would not consent to any attempt to save him, which might excite disturbance in the country. He then gave my brother some religious advice and desired him, above all, to forgive those who caused his death, and he gave us his blessing. My mother was very desirous that the whole family should pass the night with my father, but he opposed this, observing to her that he much needed some hours of repose and quiet." After a long conversation, interrupted by silence and grief, the king put an end to the painful meeting, agreeing to see his family again at 8 the next morning. "Do you promise that you will?" earnestly inquired the princesses. "Yes, yes," sorrowfully replied the king. "But when we were gone," says his daughter, "he requested that we might not be permitted to return, as our presence afflicted him too much." At this moment the queen held him by one arm, Madame Elizabeth by the other, while Madame Royale clasped him round the waist, and the dauphin stood before him, with one hand in that of his mother. At the moment of retiring, Madame Royale fainted. She was carried away, and the king returned to M. Edgeworth deeply depressed by this painful interview. The king retired to rest about midnight. M. Edgeworth threw himself upon a bed, and Clery took his place near the pillow of his master. Next morning, the 21st of January, at 5, the king awoke, called Clery, and dressed with great calmness. He congratulated himself on having recovered his strength by sleep. Clery kindled a fire and moved a chest of drawers, out of which he formed an altar. M. Edgeworth put on his pontifical robes and began to celebrate Mass. Clery waited on him, and the king listened, kneeling with the greatest devotion. He then received the communion from the hands of M. Edgeworth, and after Mass rose with new vigor and awaited with composure the moment for going to the scaffold. He asked for scissors that Clery might cut his hair, but the commune refused to trust him with a pair. At this moment the drums were beating in the capital. All who belonged to the armed sections repaired to their company with complete submission. It was reported that 400 or 500 devoted men were to make a dash upon the carriage and rescue the king. The convention, the commune, the executive council, and the Jacobins were sitting. At 8 in the morning, Santerre, with a deputation from the commune, the department, and the criminal tribunal, repaired to the temple. Louis Roman XVI, on hearing them arrive, rose and prepared to depart. He desired Clery to transmit his last farewell to his wife, his sister, and his children. He gave him a sealed packet, hair, and various trinkets, with directions to deliver these articles to them. In the course of the morning, the king said to me, "You will give this seal to my son and this ring to the queen, and assure her that it is with pain I part with it. This little packet contains the hair of all my family. You will give her that, too. Tell the queen, my dear sister, and my children, that, although I promised to see them again this morning, I have resolved to spare them the pang of so cruel a separation. Tell them how much it costs me to go away without receiving their embraces once more." He wiped away some tears, and then added in the most mournful accents, "I charge you to bear them my last farewell. Clery." He then clasped his hand and thanked him for his services. After this he addressed himself to one of the municipal officers, requesting him to transmit his last will to the commune. This officer, who had formerly been a priest and was named Jacques Roux, brutally replied that his business was to conduct him to execution and not to perform his commissions. Another person took charge of it, and Louis, turning towards the party, gave with firmness the signal for starting. Officers of gendarmerie were placed on the front seat of the carriage. The king and M. Edgeworth occupied the back. During the ride, which was rather long, the king read in M. Edgeworth's breviary the prayers for persons at the point of death. The two gendarmes were astonished at his piety and tranquil resignation. The vehicle advanced slowly, and amidst universal silence. At the Place de la Révolution, an extensive space had been left vacant about the scaffold. Around this space were planted cannon. The most violent of the Federalists were stationed about the scaffold, and the vile rabble, always ready to insult genius, virtue, and misfortune, when a signal is given it to do so, crowded behind the ranks of the Federalists, and alone manifested some outward tokens of satisfaction. At 10 minutes past 10, the carriage stopped. Louis Roman XVI, rising briskly, stepped out into the place. 3 executioners came up. He refused their assistance and took off his clothes himself, but perceiving that they were going to bind his hands, he made a movement of indignation and seemed ready to resist. Edgeworth gave him a last look and said, "Suffer this outrage, as a last resemblance to that God who is about to be your reward." At these words, the king suffered himself to be bound and conducted to the scaffold. All at once, Louis hurriedly advanced to address the people. "Frenchmen," said he, in a firm voice, "I die innocent of the crimes which are imputed to me. I forgive the authors of my death, and I pray that my blood may not fall upon France." He would have continued, but the drums were instantly ordered to beat. Their rolling drowned his voice. The executioners laid hold of him, and Edgeworth took his leave in these memorable words: "Son of St. Louis, ascend to heaven." As soon as the blood flowed, furious wretches dipped their pikes and handkerchiefs in it, then dispersed throughout Paris, shouting "Vive la République," "Vive la Nation," and even went to the gates of the temple to display brutal and factious joy. The body of Louis was, immediately after the execution, removed to the ancient cemetery of the Madeleine. Large quantities of quicklime were thrown into the grave, which occasioned so rapid a decomposition that, when his remains were sought for in 1816, it was with difficulty any part could be recovered. Over the spot where he was interred, Napoleon commenced the splendid Temple of Glory, after the Battle of Jena, and the superb edifice was completed by the Bourbons, and now forms the Church of the Madeleine, the most beautiful structure in Paris. Louis was executed on the same ground where the Queen, Madame Elizabeth, and so many other noble victims of the Revolution perished, where Robespierre and Danton afterwards suffered, and where the Emperor Alexander and the Allied sovereigns took their station when their victorious troops entered Paris in 1814. The history of modern Europe has not a scene fraught with equally interesting recollections to exhibit. It is now marked by the colossal obelisk of blood-red granite which was brought from Thebes, in Upper Egypt, in 1833 by the French government, Alison. The royal prisoner's separation of the Dauphin from his family, removal of the Queen. On the morning of the king's execution, according to the narrative of Madame Réal, his family rose at 6. The night before, my mother had scarcely strength enough to put my brother to bed. She threw herself, dressed as she was, on her own bed, where we heard her shivering with cold and grief all night long. At 6:15, the door opened. We believed that we were sent for to the king, but it was only the officers looking for a prayer book for him. We did not, however, abandon the hope of seeing him, till shouts of joy from the infuriated populace told us that all was over. In the afternoon, my mother asked to see Clary, who probably had some message for her. We hoped that seeing him would occasion a burst of grief which might relieve the state of silent and choking agony in which we saw her. The request was refused, and the officers who brought the refusal said Clary was in a frightful state of despair at not being allowed to see the royal family. Shortly afterwards, he was dismissed from the temple. "We had now a little more freedom," continues the princess. "Our guards even believed that we were about to be sent out of France, but nothing could calm my mother's agony, no hope could touch her heart, and life or death became indifferent to her. Fortunately, my own affliction increased my illness so seriously that it distracted her thoughts. My mother would go no more to the garden, because she must have passed the door of what had been my father's room, and that she could not bear. But fearing lest want of air should prove injurious to my brother and me, about the end of February, she asked permission to walk on the leads of the tower, and it was granted. The Council of the Commune, becoming aware of the interest which these sad promenades excited, and the sympathy with which they were observed from the neighboring houses, ordered that the spaces between the battlements should be filled up with shutters, which intercepted the view. But while the rules for the Queen's captivity were again made more strict, some of the municipal commissioners tried slightly to alleviate it, and by means of M. de Hue, who was at liberty in Paris, and the faithful Turgis, who remained in the tower, some communications passed between the royal family and their friends. The wife of Tisson, who waited on the queen, suspected and finally denounced these more lenient guardians, Toulain, Lepeter, Vincent, Bruno, and others, who were executed, the royal prisoners being subjected to a close examination. On the 20th of April, says Madame Real, my mother and I had just gone to bed when Hebert arrived with several municipals. We got up hastily, and these men read us a decree of the commune directing that we should be searched. My poor brother was asleep. They tore him from his bed under the pretext of examining it. My mother took him up, shivering with cold. All they took was a shopkeeper's card which my mother had happened to keep, a stick of sealing wax from my aunt, and from me, une sacre coeur de Jesus, and a prayer for the welfare of France. The search lasted from 10:30 at night till 4 o'clock in the morning. The next visit of the officials was to Madame Elizabeth alone. They found in her room a hat which the king had worn during his imprisonment, and which she had begged him to give her as a souvenir. They took it from her in spite of her entreaties. It was suspicious, said the cruel and contemptible tyrants. The Dauphin became ill with fever, and it was long before his mother, who watched by him night and day, could obtain medicine or advice for him. When Thierry was at last allowed to see him, his treatment relieved the most violent symptoms, but, says Madame Real, his health was never re-established. Want of air and exercise did him great mischief, as well as the kind of life which this poor child led, who at 8 years of age passed his days amidst the tears of his friends and in constant anxiety and agony. While the Dauphin's health was causing his family such alarm, they were deprived of the services of Tisson's wife, who became ill and finally insane, and was removed to the Hôtel Dieu, where her ravings were reported to the Assembly and made the ground of accusations against the royal prisoners. This woman, troubled by remorse, lost her reason, threw herself at the feet of the queen, implored her pardon, and disturbed the temple for many days with the sight and the noise of her madness. The princesses, forgetting the denunciations of this unfortunate being, in consideration of her repentance and insanity, watched over her by turns and deprived themselves of their own food to relieve her. Lamartine, History of the Girondists, Volume Roman 3, p. 140. No woman took her place, and the princesses themselves made their beds, swept their rooms, and waited upon the queen. Far worse punishments than menial work were prepared for them. On 3 July, a decree of the Convention ordered that the Dauphin should be separated from his family and placed in the most secure apartment of the tower. As soon as he heard this decree pronounced, says his sister, he threw himself into my mother's arms and with violent cries entreated not to be parted from her. My mother would not let her son go, and she actually defended against the efforts of the officers the bed in which she had placed him. The men threatened to call up the guard and use violence. My mother exclaimed that they had better kill her than tear her child from her. At last, they threatened our lives, and my mother's maternal tenderness forced her to the sacrifice. My aunt and I dressed the child, for my poor mother had no longer strength for anything. Nevertheless, when he was dressed, she took him up in her arms and delivered him herself to the officers, bathing him with her tears, foreseeing that she was never to behold him again. The poor little fellow embraced us all tenderly and was carried away in a flood of tears. My mother's horror was extreme when she heard that Simon, a shoemaker by trade, whom she had seen as a municipal officer in the temple, was the person to whom her child was confided. The officers now no longer remained in my mother's apartment. They only came 3 times a day to bring our meals and examine the bolts and bars of our windows. We were locked up together night and day. We often went up to the tower, because my brother went, too, from the other side. The only pleasure my mother enjoyed was seeing him through a crevice as he passed at a distance. She would watch for hours together to see him as he passed. It was her only hope, her only thought. The queen was soon deprived even of this melancholy consolation. On 1st August, 1793, it was resolved that she should be tried. Robespierre opposed the measure, but Barre aroused into action that deep-rooted hatred of the queen which not even the sacrifice of her life availed to eradicate. Why do the enemies of the Republic still hope for success? He asked. Is it because we have too long forgotten the crimes of the Austrian? The children of Louis the Conspirator are hostages for the Republic. But behind them lurks a woman who has been the cause of all the disasters of France. At 2 o'clock on the morning of the following day, the municipal officers awoke us, says Madame Real. to read to my mother the decree of the convention, which ordered her removal to the conciergerie. The conciergerie was originally, as its name implies, the porter's lodge of the ancient palace of justice, and became in time a prison, from the custom of confining their persons who had committed trifling offenses about the court. Preparatory to her trial, she heard it without visible emotion and without speaking a single word. My aunt and I immediately asked to be allowed to accompany my mother, but this favor was refused us. All the time my mother was making up a bundle of clothes to take with her, these officers never left her. She was even obliged to dress herself before them, and they asked for her pockets, taking away the trifles they contained. She embraced me, charging me to keep up my spirits and my courage, to take tender care of my aunt and obey her as a second mother. She then threw herself into my aunt's arms and recommended her children to her care. My aunt replied to her in a whisper, and she was then hurried away. In leaving the temple, she struck her head against the wicket, not having stooped low enough. Matthew, the jailer, used to say, "I make Madame Vito and her sister and daughter, proud though they are, salute me, for the door is so low they cannot pass without bowing." The officers asked whether she had hurt herself. "No," she replied, "nothing can hurt me now." The last moments of Marie Antoinette. We have already seen what changes had been made in the temple. Marie Antoinette had been separated from her sister, her daughter, and her son by virtue of a decree which ordered the trial and exile of the last members of the family of the Bourbons. She had been removed to the conciergerie, and there, alone in a narrow prison, she was reduced to what was strictly necessary, like the other prisoners. The imprudence of a devoted friend had rendered her situation still more irksome. Michanis, a member of the municipality, in whom she had excited a warm interest, was desirous of introducing to her a person who, he said, wished to see her out of curiosity. This man, a courageous emigrant, threw to her a carnation, in which was enclosed a slip of very fine paper with these words: "Your friends are ready, false hope, and equally dangerous for her who received it, and for him who gave it." Michanis and the emigrant were detected, and forthwith apprehended, and the vigilance exercised in regard to the unfortunate prisoner became from that day more rigorous than ever. The queen was lodged in a room called the council chamber, which was considered as the most unwholesome apartment in the conciergerie on account of its dampness and the bad smells by which it was continually affected. Under pretense of giving her a person to wait upon her, they placed near her a spy man of a horrible countenance and hollow sepulchral voice. This wretch, whose name was Barricin, was a robber and murderer by profession. Such was the chosen attendant on the Queen of France. A few days before her trial, this wretch was removed and a gendarme placed in her chamber, who watched over her night and day, and from whom she was not separated, even when in bed, but by a ragged curtain. In this melancholy abode Marie Antoinette had no other dress than an old black gown, stockings with holes, which she was forced to mend every day, and she was entirely destitute of shoes. Dubroca. Gendarmes were to mount guard incessantly at the door of her prison, and they were expressly forbidden to answer anything that she might say to them. That wretch Hebert, the deputy of Chaumet, and editor of the disgusting paper Pierre Duchesne, a writer of the party of which Vincent, Ronson, Varlet, and Leclerc were the leaders, Hebert had made it his particular business to torment the unfortunate remnant of the dethroned family. He asserted that the family of the tyrant ought not to be better treated than any sansculotte family, and he had caused a resolution to be passed by which the sort of luxury in which the prisoners in the temple were maintained was to be suppressed. They were no longer to be allowed either poultry or pastry. They were reduced to one sort of aliment for breakfast, and to soup or broth and a single dish for dinner, to 2 dishes for supper, and half a bottle of wine apiece. Tallow candles were to be furnished instead of wag, pewter instead of silver plate, and delft ware instead of porcelain. The wood and water carriers alone were permitted to enter their room, and that only accompanied by 2 commissioners. Their food was to be introduced to them by means of a turning box. The numerous establishment was reduced to a cook and an assistant, 2 men servants, and a woman servant to attend to the linen. As soon as this resolution was passed, Hebert had repaired to the temple and inhumanly taken away from the unfortunate prisoners even the most trifling articles to which they attached a high value. 80 louis which Madame Elizabeth had in reserve, and which she had received from Madame de Lamballe, were also taken away. No one is more dangerous, more cruel, than the man without acquirements, without education, clothed with a recent authority. If, above all, he possess a base nature, if, like Hebert, who was check-taker at the door of a theater, and embezzled money out of the receipts, he be destitute of natural morality, and if he leap all at once from the mud of his condition into power, he is as mean as he is atrocious. Such was Hebert in his conduct at the temple. He did not confine himself to the annoyances which we have mentioned. He and some others conceived the idea of separating the young prince from his aunt and sister. A shoemaker named Simon and his wife were the instructors to whom it was deemed right to consign him for the purpose of giving him a sans-culotte education. Simon and his wife were shut up in the temple, and, becoming prisoners with the unfortunate child, were directed to bring him up in their own way. Their food was better than that of the princesses, and they shared the table of the municipal commissioners who were on duty. Simon was permitted to go down, accompanied by 2 commissioners, to the court of the temple, for the purpose of giving the dauphin a little exercise. Hebert conceived the infamous idea of wringing from this boy revelations to criminate his unhappy mother. Whether this wretch imputed to the child false revelations, or abused his tender age and his condition to extort from him what admissions soever he pleased, he obtained a revolting deposition. And as the youth of the prince did not admit of his being brought before the tribunal, Hebert appeared and detailed the infamous particulars which he had himself either dictated or invented. It was on the 14th of October that Marie Antoinette appeared before her judges. Dragged before the sanguinary tribunal by inexorable revolutionary vengeance, she appeared there without any chance of acquittal, for it was not to obtain her acquittal that the Jacobins had brought her before it. It was necessary, however, to make some charges. Fauquier therefore collected the rumors current among the populace ever since the arrival of the princess in France, and, in the act of accusation, he charged her with having plundered the exchequer, first for her pleasures, and afterwards in order to transmit money to her brother, the emperor. He insisted on the scenes of the 5th and 6th of October, and on the dinners of the Life Guards, alleging that she had at that period framed a plot, which obliged the people to go to Versailles to frustrate it. He afterwards accused her of having governed her husband, interfered in the choice of ministers, conducted the intrigues with the deputies gained by the court, prepared the journey to Varennes, provoked the war, and transmitted to the enemy's generals all our plans of campaign. He further accused her of having prepared a new conspiracy on the 10th of August, of having on that day caused the people to be fired upon, having induced her husband to defend himself by taxing him with cowardice. Lastly, of having never ceased to plot and correspond with foreigners since her captivity in the temple, and of having there treated her young son as king. We here observe how, on the terrible day of long-deferred vengeance, when subjects at length break forth and strike such of their princes as have not deserved the blow, everything is distorted and converted into crime. We see how the profusion and fondness for pleasure, so natural to a young princess, how her attachment to her native country, her influence over her husband, her regrets, always more indiscreet in a woman than a man, nay, even her bolder courage, appeared to their inflamed or malignant imaginations. It was necessary to produce witnesses. Lecointre, deputy of Versailles, who had seen what had passed on the 5th and 6th of October, Hebert, who had frequently visited the temple, various clerks in the ministerial offices, and several domestic servants of the old court were summoned. Admiral d'Estaing, formerly commandant of the Guard of Versailles, Manuel, the ex-procureur of the Commune, Latter Dupin, Minister of War in 1789, the venerable Bailly, who, it was said, had been, with Lafayette, an accomplice in the journey to Varennes. Lastly, valets, one of the girondists destined to the scaffold, were taken from their prisons and compelled to give evidence. No precise fact was elicited. Some had seen the Queen in high spirits when the Life Guards testified their attachment. Others had seen her vexed and dejected while being conducted to Paris or brought back from Varennes. These had been present at splendid festivities which must have cost enormous sums. Those had heard it said in the ministerial offices that the Queen was adverse to the sanction of the decrees. An ancient waiting woman of the Queen had heard the Duc de Coigny say, in 1788, that the Emperor had already received 200 millions from France to make war upon the Turks. The cynical Hebert, being brought before the unfortunate Queen, dared at length to prefer the charges wrung from the young prince. He said that Charles Capet had given Simon an account of the journey to Varennes and mentioned Lafayette and Bailey as having cooperated in it. He then added that this boy was addicted to odious and very premature vices for his age, that he had been surprised by Simon, who, on questioning him, learned that he derived from his mother the vices in which he indulged. Hebert said that it was no doubt the intention of Marie Antoinette, by weakening thus early the physical constitution of her son, to secure to herself the means of ruling him in case he should ever ascend the throne. The rumors which had been whispered for 20 years by a malicious court had given the people a most unfavorable opinion of the morals of the queen. That audience, however, though wholly Jacobin, was disgusted at the accusations of Hebert. Can there be a more infernal invention than that made against the Queen by H.D. Burt, namely, that she had had an improper intimacy with her own son? He made use of this sublime idea of which he boasted in order to prejudice the women against the queen and to prevent her execution from exciting pity. It had, however, no other effect than that of disgusting all parties. Prudhomme. He nevertheless persisted in supporting them. Hebert did not long survive her in whose sufferings he had taken such an infamous part. He was executed on 26 March, 1794. The unhappy mother made no reply. Urged anew to explain herself, she said, with extraordinary emotion, "I thought that human nature would excuse me from answering such an imputation, but I appeal from it to the heart of every mother here present." This noble and simple reply affected all who heard it. In the depositions of the witnesses, however, all was not so bitter for Marie Antoinette. The brave D'Estaing, whose enemy she had been, would not say anything to inculpate her, and spoke only of the courage which she had shown on the 5th and 6th of October, and of the noble resolution which she had expressed, to die beside her husband rather than fly. Manuel, in spite of his enmity to the court during the time of the Legislative Assembly, declared that he could not say anything against the accused. When the venerable Bailey was brought forward, who formerly so often predicted to the court the calamities which its imprudence must produce, he appeared painfully affected, and when he was asked if he knew the wife of Capet, "Yes," said he, bowing respectfully, "I have known Madame." He declared that he knew nothing, and maintained that the declarations extorted from the young prince relative to the journey to Varennes were false. In recompense for his deposition, he was assailed with outrageous reproaches, from which he might judge what fate would soon be awarded to himself. In all the evidence there appeared but two serious facts, attested by Ladder Dupin and Valets, who deposed to them because they could not help it. Ladder Dupin declared that Marie Antoinette had applied to him for an accurate statement of the armies while he was Minister of War. Valets, always cold but respectful towards misfortune, would not say anything to criminate the accused. Yet he could not help declaring that, as a member of the Commission of 24, being charged with his colleagues to examine the papers found at the house of Septuil, treasurer of the civil list, he had seen bonds for various sums signed Antoinette, which was very natural. But he added that he had also seen a letter, in which the minister requested the king to transmit to the queen the copy of the plan of campaign which he had in his hands. The most unfavorable construction was immediately put upon these two facts, the application for a statement of the armies and the communication of the plan of campaign, and it was concluded that they could not be wanted for any other purpose than to be sent to the enemy, for it was not supposed that a young princess should turn her attention, merely for her own satisfaction, to matters of administration and military plans. After these depositions, several others were received respecting the expenses of the court, the influence of the queen in public affairs, the scene of the 10th of August, and what had passed in the Temple, and the most vague rumors and most trivial circumstances were eagerly caught at as proofs. Marie Antoinette frequently repeated, with presence of mind and firmness, that there was no precise fact against her, that, besides, though the wife of Louis Roman XVI, she was not answerable for any of the acts of his reign. At first the queen, consulting only her own sense of dignity, had resolved on her trial to make no other reply to the questions of her judges than assassinate me as you have already assassinated my husband. Afterwards, however, she determined to follow the example of the king, exert herself in her defense, and leave her judges without any excuse or protest for putting her to death. Weber. Memoirs of Marie Antoinette. Fauquier nevertheless declared her to be sufficiently convicted. Chevalier made unavailing efforts to defend her, and the unfortunate queen was condemned to suffer the same fate as her husband. Conveyed back to the conciergerie, she there passed in tolerable composure the night preceding her execution, and on the morning of the following day, the 16th of October, she was conducted, amidst a great concourse of the populace, to the fatal spot where 10 months before Louis Roman XVI had perished. The queen, after having written and prayed, slept soundly for some hours. On her waking, Balt's daughter dressed her and adjusted her hair with more neatness than on other days. Marie Antoinette wore a white gown, a white handkerchief covered her shoulders, a white cap her hair. A black ribbon bound this cap round her temples. The cries, the looks, the laughter, the jests of the people overwhelmed her with humiliation. Her color, changing continually from purple to paleness, betrayed her agitation. On reaching the scaffold, she inadvertently trod on the executioner's foot. "Pardon me," she said courteously. She knelt for an instant and uttered a half-audible prayer, then rising and glancing towards the towers of the temple, "Adieu, once again, my children," she said. "I go to rejoin your father, Lamartine." She listened with calmness to the exhortations of the ecclesiastic who accompanied her, and cast an indifferent look at the people who had so often applauded her beauty and her grace, and who now as warmly applauded her execution. On reaching the foot of the scaffold, she perceived the Tuileries, and appeared to be moved, but she hastened to ascend the fatal ladder, and gave herself up with courage to the executioner. Sorrow had blanched the queen's once beautiful hair, but her features and air still commanded the admiration of all who beheld her. Her cheeks, pale and emaciated, were occasionally tinged with a vivid color at the mention of those she had lost. When led out to execution, she was dressed in white. She had cut off her hair with her own hands. Placed in a tumbrel, with her arms tied behind her, she was taken by a circuitous route to the Place de la Révolution, and she ascended the scaffold with a firm and dignified step, as if she had been about to take her place on a throne by the side of her husband, Lacretelle. The infamous wretch exhibited her head to the people, as he was accustomed to do when he had sacrificed an illustrious victim. The last separation execution of Madame Elizabeth, death of the Dauphin. The two princesses left in the temple were now almost inconsolable. They spent days and nights in tears, whose only alleviation was that they were shed together. "The company of my aunt, whom I loved so tenderly," said Madame Réal, "was a great comfort to me. But alas, all that I loved was perishing around me, and I was soon to lose her also. In the beginning of September, I had an illness caused solely by my anxiety about my mother. I never heard a drum beat that I did not expect another 3d of September, when the head of the Princess de Lamballe was carried to the temple. In the course of the month, the rigor of their captivity was much increased. The Commune ordered that they should only have one room, that Tisson, who had done the heaviest of the household work for them, and since the kindness they showed to his insane wife had occasionally given them tidings of the Dauphin, should be imprisoned in the turret, that they should be supplied with only the barest necessaries, and that no one should enter their room save to carry water and firewood. Their quantity of firing was reduced, and they were not allowed candles. They were also forbidden to go on the leads, and their large sheets were taken away, lest notwithstanding the gratings, they should escape from the windows. On 8th October, 1793, Madame Réal was ordered to go downstairs, that she might be interrogated by some municipal officers. My aunt, who was greatly affected, would have followed, but they stopped her. She asked whether I should be permitted to come up again. Chaumette assured her that I should. "You may trust," said he, "the word of an honest Republican. She shall return." I soon found myself in my brother's room, whom I embraced tenderly, but we were torn asunder, and I was obliged to go into another room. Chaumette then questioned me about 1,000 shocking things of which they accused my mother and aunt. I was so indignant at hearing such horrors that, terrified as I was, I could not help exclaiming that they were infamous falsehoods. But in spite of my tears, they still pressed their questions. There were some things which I did not comprehend, but of which I understood enough to make me weep with indignation and horror. They then asked me about Varennes and other things. I answered as well as I could without implicating anybody. I had always heard my parents say that it were better to die than to implicate anybody. When the examination was over, the princess begged to be allowed to join her mother, but Chaumette said he could not obtain permission for her to do so. She was then cautioned to say nothing about her examination to her aunt, who was next to appear before them. Madame Elizabeth, her niece declares, replied with still more contempt to their shocking questions. The only intimation of the Queen's fate which her daughter and her sister-in-law were allowed to receive was through hearing her sentence cried by the newsman. But we could not persuade ourselves that she was dead, writes Madame Réal. A hope, so natural to the unfortunate, persuaded us that she must have been saved. For 18 months I remained in this cruel suspense. We learnt also by the cries of the newsmen the death of the Duc d'Orléans. It was the only piece of news that reached us during the whole winter. The Duc d'Orléans, the early and interested propagator of the revolution, was its next victim. Billaud Varennes said in the convention, "The time has come when all the conspirators should be known and struck. I demand that we no longer pass over in silence a man whom we seem to have forgotten, despite the numerous facts against him. I demand that d'Orléans be sent to the Revolutionary Tribunal." The convention, once his hireling adulators, unanimously supported the proposal. In vain he alleged his having been accessory to the disorders of 5th October, his support of the revolt on 10th August, 1792, his vote against the king on 17th January, 1793. His condemnation was pronounced. He then asked only for a delay of 24 hours and had a repast carefully prepared, on which he feasted with avidity. When let out for execution, he gazed with a smile on the Palais Royal, the scene of his former orgies. He was detained for a quarter of an hour before that palace by the order of Robespierre, who had asked his daughter's hand and promised in return to excite a tumult in which the Duke's life should be saved. Depraved though he was, he would not consent to such a sacrifice, and he met his fate with stoical fortitude. Alison, Volume Roman 3, p. 172. The severity with which the prisoners were treated was carried into every detail of their life. The officers who guarded them took away their chessmen and cards, because some of them were named kings and queens, and all the books with coats of arms on them. They refused to get ointment for a gathering on Madame Elizabeth's arm. They would not allow her to make a herb tea which she thought would strengthen her niece. They declined to supply fish or eggs on fast days or during Lent, bringing only coarse fat meat, and brutally replying to all remonstrances. None but fools believe in that stuff nowadays. Madame Elizabeth never made the officials another request, but reserved some of the bread and café au lait from her breakfast for her second meal. The time during which she could be thus tormented was growing short. On 9th May 1794, as the princesses were going to bed, the outside bolts of the door were unfastened and a loud knocking was heard. "When my aunt was dressed," says Madame Réal, "she opened the door and they said to her, 'Citoyenne, come down, and my niece, we shall take care of her afterwards.' She embraced me, and to calm my agitation promised to return. 'No, citoyenne,' said the men, 'bring your bonnet, you shall not return.' They overwhelmed her with abuse, but she bore it patiently, embracing me and exhorting me to trust in heaven and never to forget the last commands of my father and mother. Madame Elizabeth was then taken to the conciergerie, where she was interrogated by the vice-president at midnight, and then allowed to take some hours' rest on the bed on which Marie Antoinette had slept for the last time. In the morning, she was brought before the tribunal, with 24 other prisoners, of varying ages and both sexes, some of whom had once been frequently seen at court. "Of what has Elizabeth to complain?" Fauquier Tinville satirically asked. At the foot of the guillotine, surrounded by faithful nobility, she may imagine herself again at Versailles. "You call my brother a tyrant," the princess replied to her accuser. "If he had been what you say, you would not be where you are, nor I before you." She was sentenced to death, and showed neither surprise nor grief. "I am ready to die," she said, happy in the prospect of rejoining in a better world those whom I loved on earth. On being taken to the room where those condemned to suffer at the same time as herself were assembled, she spoke to them with so much piety and resignation that they were encouraged by her example to show calmness and courage like her own. The women, on leaving the cart, begged to embrace her, and she said some words of comfort to each in turn as they mounted the scaffold, which she was not allowed to ascend till all her companions had been executed before her eyes. Madame Elizabeth was one of those rare personages only seen at distant intervals during the course of ages. She set an example of steadfast piety in the Palace of Kings. She lived amid her family, the favorite of all and the admiration of the world. When I went to Versailles, Madame Elizabeth was 22 years of age. Her plump figure and pretty pink color must have attracted notice, and her air of calmness and contentment even more than her beauty. She was fond of billiards, and her elegance and courage in writing were remarkable. But she never allowed these amusements to interfere with her religious observances. At that time, her wish to take the veil at St. Cyr was much talked of, but the king was too fond of his sister to endure the separation. There were also rumors of a marriage between Madame Elizabeth and the Emperor Joseph. The queen was sincerely attached to her brother and loved her sister-in-law most tenderly. She ardently desired this marriage as a means of raising the princess to one of the first thrones in Europe and as a possible means of turning the emperor from his innovations. She had been very carefully educated, had talent in music and painting, spoke Italian and a little Latin, and understood mathematics. Her last moments were worthy of her courage and virtue. De Hezex's Recollections, pp. 70–75. It is impossible to imagine my distress at finding myself separated from my aunt, says Madame Réal. Since I had been able to appreciate her merits, I saw in her nothing but religion, gentleness, meekness, modesty, and a devoted attachment to her family. She sacrificed her life for them, since nothing could persuade her to leave the king and queen. I never can be sufficiently grateful to her for her goodness to me, which ended only with her life. She looked on me as her child, and I honored and loved her as a second mother. I was thought to be very like her in countenance, and I feel conscious that I have something of her character. Would to God I might imitate her virtues, and hope that I may hereafter deserve to meet her, as well as my dear parents, in the bosom of our Creator, where I cannot doubt that they enjoy the reward of their virtuous lives and meritorious deaths. Madame Réal vainly begged to be allowed to rejoin her mother or her aunt, or at least to know their fate. The municipal officers would tell her nothing, and rudely refused her request to have a woman placed with her. I asked nothing but what seemed indispensable, though it was often harshly refused, she says, but I at least could keep myself clean. Had soap and water and carefully swept out my room every day. I had no light, but in the long days I did not feel this privation much. I had some religious works and travels, which I had read over and over. Had also some knitting, qui emeniate beaucoup. Once, she believes, Robespierre visited her prison. It has been said that Robespierre vainly tried to obtain the hand of Mademoiselle d'Orléans. It was also rumored that Madame Réal herself owed her life to his matrimonial ambition. The officers showed him great respect. The people in the tower did not know him, or at least would not tell me who he was. He stared insolently at me, glanced at my books, and after joining the municipal officers in a search, retired. On another occasion, 3 men in scarfs, who entered the princess's room, told her that they did not see why she should wish to be released, as she seemed very comfortable. It is dreadful, I replied, to be separated for more than a year from one's mother, without even hearing what has become of her or of my aunt. You are not ill, no, monsieur, but the cruelest illness is that of the heart. We can do nothing for you. Be patient and submit to the justice and goodness of the French people. I had nothing more to say. Duchesse d'Angoulême, Royal Memoirs, p. 273. When Laurent was appointed by the Convention to the charge of the young prisoners, Madame Réal was treated with more consideration. He was always courteous, she says. He restored her tinderbox, gave her fresh books, and allowed her candles and as much firewood as she wanted, which pleased me greatly. This simple expression of relief gives a clearer idea of what the delicate girl must have suffered than a volume of complaints. But however hard Madame Réal's lot might be, that of the Dauphin was infinitely harder. Though only 8 years old when he entered the temple, he was by nature and education extremely precocious. His memory retained everything, and his sensitiveness comprehended everything. His features recalled the somewhat effeminate look of Louis Roman XV, and the Austrian hauteur of Maria Theresa. His blue eyes, aquiline nose, elevated nostrils, well-defined mouth, pouting lips, chestnut hair parted in the middle and falling in thick curls on his shoulders, resembled his mother before her years of tears and torture. All the beauty of his race, by both descents, seemed to reappear in him. For some time, the care of his parents preserved his health and cheerfulness even in the temple. But his constitution was weakened by the fever recorded by his sister, and his jailers were determined that he should never regain strength. "What does the convention intend to do with him?" asked Simon when the innocent victim was placed in his clutches. "Transport him." "No." "Kill him." "No." "Poison him." "No." "What then?" "Why, get rid of him." For such a purpose they could not have chosen their instruments better. Simon and his wife cut off all those fair locks that had been his youthful glory and his mother's pride. This worthy pair stripped him of the mourning he wore for his father, and as they did so, they called it playing at the game of the spoiled king. They alternately induced him to commit excesses and then half-starved him. They beat him mercilessly, nor was the treatment by night less brutal than that by day. As soon as the weary boy had sunk into his first profound sleep, they would loudly call him by name, Capet, Capet. Startled, nervous, bathed in perspiration, or sometimes trembling with cold, he would spring up, rush through the dark, and present himself at Simon's bedside, murmuring tremblingly, "I am here, citizen. Come nearer, let me feel you." He would approach the bed as he was ordered, although he knew the treatment that awaited him. Simon would buffet him on the head or kick him away, adding the remark, "Get to bed again, wolf's cub. I only wanted to know that you were safe." On one of these occasions, when the child had fallen half-stunned upon his own miserable couch and lay there groaning and faint with pain, Simon roared out with a laugh, "Suppose you were king, Capet, what would you do to me?" The child thought of his father's dying words and said, "I would forgive you." The change in the young prince's mode of life, and the cruelties and caprices to which he was subjected, soon made him fall ill, says his sister. Simon forced him to eat to excess, and to drink large quantities of wine, which he detested. He grew extremely fat without increasing in height or strength. His aunt and sister, deprived of the pleasure of tending him, had the pain of hearing his childish voice raised in the abominable songs his jailers taught him. The brutality of Simon depraved at once the body and soul of his pupil. He called him the young wolf of the temple. He treated him as the young of wild animals are treated when taken from the mother and reduced to captivity at once intimidated by blows and enervated by taming. He punished for sensibility. He rewarded meanness. He encouraged vice. He made the child wait on him at table, sometimes striking him on the face with a knotted towel, sometimes raising the poker and threatening to strike him with it. Simon left the temple to become a municipal officer. He was involved in the overthrow of Robespierre and guillotined the day after him, 29th July, 1794. Yet when Simon was removed, the poor young prince's condition became even worse. His horrible loneliness induced an apathetic stupor to which any suffering would have been preferable. He passed his days without any kind of occupation. They did not allow him light in the evening. His keepers never approached him but to give him food, and on the rare occasions when they took him to the platform of the tower, he was unable or unwilling to move about. When in November 1794 a commissary named Gammon arrived at the temple, disposed to treat the little prisoner with kindness, it was too late. "He took extreme care of my brother," says Madame Real. "For a long time the unhappy child had been shut up in darkness, and he was dying of fright. He was very grateful for the attentions of Gammon and became much attached to him. But his physical condition was alarming, and, owing to Gammon's representations, a commission was instituted to examine him. The commissioners appointed were Harmond, Matthew, and Reverchin, who visited Louis Charles, as he was now called, in the month of February, 1795. They found the young prince seated at a square deal table, at which he was playing with some dirty cards, making card houses, and the like, the materials having been furnished him, probably, that they might figure in the report as evidences of indulgence. He did not look up from the table as the commissioners entered. He was in a slate-colored dress, bareheaded. The room was reported as clean, the bed in good condition, the linen fresh. His clothes were also reported as new. But in spite of all these assertions, it is well known that his bed had not been made for months, that he had not left his room, nor was permitted to leave it for any purpose whatever, that it was consequently uninhabitable, and that he was covered with vermin and with sores. The swellings at his knees alone were sufficient to disable him from walking. One of the commissioners approached the young prince respectfully. The latter did not raise his head. Harmond, in a kind voice, begged him to speak to them. The eyes of the boy remained fixed on the table before him. They told him of the kindly intentions of the government, of their hopes that he would yet be happy, and their desire that he would speak unreservedly to the medical man that was to visit him. He seemed to listen with profound attention, but not a single word passed his lips. It was an heroic principle that impelled that poor young heart to maintain the silence of a mute in presence of these men. He remembered too well the days when 3 other commissaries waited on him, regaled him with pastry and wine, and obtained from him that hellish accusation against the mother that he loved. He had learnt by some means the import of the act, so far as it was an injury to his mother. He now dreaded seeing again 3 commissaries, hearing again kind words, and being treated again with fine promises. Dumb as death itself, he sat before them, and remained motionless as stone and as mute. His disease now made rapid progress, and Gamin and Lasny, superintendents of the temple, thinking it necessary to inform the government of the melancholy condition of their prisoner, wrote on the register, "Little Capet is unwell." No notice was taken of this account, which was renewed next day in more urgent terms. "Little Capet is dangerously ill." Still, there was no word from beyond the walls. "We must knock harder," said the keepers to each other, and they added, "It is feared he will not live," to the words dangerously ill. At length, on Wednesday, 6th May, 1795, 3 days after the first report, the authorities appointed M. de Salt to give the invalid the assistance of his art. After having written down his name on the register, he was admitted to see the prince. He made a long and very attentive examination of the unfortunate child, asked him many questions without being able to obtain an answer, and contented himself with prescribing a decoction of hops, to be taken by spoonfuls every half-hour, from 6 o'clock in the morning till 8 in the evening. On the first day, the prince steadily refused to take it. In vain Gamin several times drank off a glass of the potion in his presence. His example proved as ineffectual as his words. Next day Lasny renewed his solicitations. "Monsieur knows very well that I desire nothing but the good of his health, and he distresses me deeply by thus refusing to take what might contribute to it. I entreat him as a favor not to give me this cause of grief." And as Lasny, while speaking, began to taste the potion in a glass, the child took what he offered him out of his hands. "You have, then, taken an oath that I should drink it," said he, firmly. "Well, give it me, I will drink it." From that moment, he conformed with docility to whatever was required of him, but the policy of the commune had attained its object. Help had been withheld till it was almost a mockery to supply it. The prince's weakness was excessive. His keepers could scarcely drag him to the top of the tower. Walking hurt his tender feet, and at every step he stopped to press the arm of Lasny with both hands upon his breast. At last he suffered so much that it was no longer possible for him to walk, and his keeper carried him about, sometimes on the platform, and sometimes in the little tower, where the royal family had lived at first. But the slight improvement to his health occasioned by the change of air scarcely compensated for the pain which his fatigue gave him. On the battlement of the platform nearest the left turret, the rain had, by perseverance through ages, hollowed out a kind of basin. The water that fell remained there for several days, and as, during the spring of 1795, storms were of frequent occurrence, this little sheet of water was kept constantly supplied. Whenever the child was brought out upon the platform, he saw a little troop of sparrows, which used to come to drink and bathe in this reservoir. At first they flew away at his approach, but from being accustomed to see him walking quietly there every day, they at last grew more familiar, and did not spread their wings for flight till he came up close to them. They were always the same, he knew them by sight, and perhaps like himself they were inhabitants of that ancient pile. He called them his birds, and his first action, when the door into the terrace was opened, was to look towards that side end the sparrows were always there. He delighted in their chirping, and he must have envied them their wings. Though so little could be done to alleviate his sufferings, a moral improvement was taking place in him. He was touched by the lively interest displayed by his physician, who never failed to visit him at 9 o'clock every morning. He seemed pleased with the attention paid him, and ended by placing entire confidence in M. de Salt. Gratitude loosened his tongue, brutality and insult had failed to extort a murmur, but kind treatment restored his speech. He had no words for anger, but he found them to express his thanks. M. de Salt prolonged his visits as long as the officers of the municipality would permit. When they announced the close of the visit, the child, unwilling to beg them to allow a longer time, held back M. de Salt by the skirt of his coat. Suddenly, M. de Salt's visit ceased. Several days passed and nothing was heard of him. The keepers wondered at his absence, and the poor little invalid was much distressed at it. The commissary on duty, M. Benoist, suggested that it would be proper to send to the physician's house to make inquiries as to the cause of so long an absence. Gammon and Larn had not yet ventured to follow this advice, when next day M. Benoist was relieved by M. Bidault, who, hearing M. de Salt's name mentioned as he came in, immediately said, "You must not expect to see him any more. He died yesterday." M. Pelletan, head surgeon of the Grand Hospice de l'Humanite, was next directed to attend the prisoner, and in June he found him in so alarming a state that he at once asked for a coadjutor, fearing to undertake the responsibility alone. The physician sent for form's sake to attend the dying child, as an advocate is given by law to a criminal condemned, beforehand blamed the officers of the municipality for not having removed the blind, which obstructed the light, and the numerous bolts, the noise of which never failed to remind the victim of his captivity. That sound, which always caused him an involuntary shudder, disturbed him in the last mournful scene of his unparalleled tortures. M. Pelletan said authoritatively to the municipal on duty, "If you will not take these bolts and casings away at once, at least you can make no objection to our carrying the child into another room, for I suppose we are sent here to take charge of him." The prince, being disturbed by these words, spoken as they were with great animation, made a sign to the physician to come nearer. "Speak lower, I beg of you," said he. "I am afraid they will hear you upstairs, and I should be very sorry for them to know that I am ill, as it would give them much uneasiness." At first the change to a cheerful and airy room revived the prince and gave him evident pleasure, but the improvement did not last. Next day M. Pelletan learned that the government had acceded to his request for a colleague. M. Dumingen, head physician of the Hospice de l'Unite, made his appearance at his house on the morning of Sunday, 7th June, with the official dispatch sent him by the Committee of Public Safety. They repaired together immediately to the tower. On their arrival, they heard that the child, whose weakness was excessive, had had a fainting fit, which had occasioned fears to be entertained that his end was approaching. He had revived a little, however, when the physicians went up at about 9 o'clock. Unable to contend with increasing exhaustion, they perceived there was no longer any hope of prolonging an existence worn out by so much suffering, and that all their art could effect would be to soften the last stage of this lamentable disease. While standing by the prince's bed, Gammon noticed that he was quietly crying and asked him kindly what was the matter. "I am always alone," he said. "My dear mother remains in the other tower." Night came his last night, which the regulations of the prison condemned him to pass once more in solitude, with suffering, his old companion, only at his side. This time, however, death, too, stood at his pillow. When Gammon went up to the child's room on the morning of 8th June, he said, seeing him calm, motionless, and mute, "I hope you are not in pain just now." "Oh yes, I am still in pain, but not nearly so much. The music is so beautiful." Now there was no music to be heard, either in the tower or anywhere near. Gammon, astonished, said to him, "From what direction do you hear this music?" "From above." "Have you heard it long?" "Since you knelt down, do you not hear it? Listen, listen." And the child, with a nervous motion, raised his faltering hand as he opened his large eyes illuminated by delight. His poor keeper, unwilling to destroy this last sweet illusion, appeared to listen also. After a few minutes of attention, the child again started and cried out, in intense rapture, "Amongst all the voices I have distinguished that of my mother." These were almost his last words. At 2:15 he died, Lasny only being in the room at the time. Lasny acquainted Gammon and Damont, the commissary on duty, with the event, and they repaired to the chamber of death. The poor little royal corpse was carried from the room into that where he had suffered so long, where for 2 years he had never ceased to suffer. From this apartment the father had gone to the scaffold, and thence the son must pass to the burial ground. The remains were laid out on the bed, and the doors of the apartment were set open, doors which had remained closed ever since the Revolution had seized on a child, then full of vigor and grace and life and health. At 8 o'clock next morning, 9th June, 4 members of the Committee of General Safety came to the tower to make sure that the prince was really dead. When they were admitted to the death chamber by Lasny and Damont, they affected the greatest indifference. "The event is not of the least importance," they repeated, several times over. "The police commissary of the section will come and receive the declaration of the deceased. He will acknowledge it and proceed to the interment without any ceremony, and the committee will give the necessary directions." As they withdrew, some officers of the temple guard asked to see the remains of little Capet. Damont, having observed that the guard would not permit the bier to pass without its being opened, the deputies decided that the officers and non-commissioned officers of the guard going off duty, together with those coming on, should be all invited to assure themselves of the child's death. All having assembled in the room where the body lay, he asked them if they recognized it as that of the ex-dauphin, son of the last king of France. Those who had seen the young prince at the Tuileries or at the Temple, and most of them had, bore witness to its being the body of Louis Roman XVII. When they were come down into the council room, Darlot drew up the minutes of this attestation, which was signed by a score of persons. These minutes were inserted in the journal of the Temple Tower, which was afterwards deposited in the office of the Minister of the Interior. During this visit, the surgeons entrusted with the autopsy arrived at the outer gate of the temple. These were Dumingin, head physician of the Hospice de l'Unite, Pelletan, head surgeon of the Grand Hospice de l'Humanite, Jeanroy, professor in the medical schools of Paris, and Lassus, professor of legal medicine at the École de Saint of Paris. The last two were selected by Dumingin and Pelletan because of the former connection of M. Lachuze with Mesdames de France and of M. Jeanroy with the House of Lorraine, which gave a peculiar weight to their signatures. Gaumon received them in the council room and detained them until the National Guard, descending from the second floor, entered to sign the minutes prepared by Darlot. This done, Lasny, Darlot, and Bouquet went up again with the surgeons and introduced them into the apartment of Louis Roman XVII, whom they at first examined as he lay on his deathbed. But M. Jeanroy, observing that the dim light of this room was but little favorable to the accomplishment of their mission, the commissaries prepared a table in the first room, near the window, on which the corpse was laid, and the surgeons began their melancholy operation. At 7 o'clock, the police commissary ordered the body to be taken up, and that they should proceed to the cemetery. It was the season of the longest days, and therefore the interment did not take place in secrecy, and at night, as some misinformed narrators have said or written. It took place in broad daylight and attracted a great concourse of people before the gates of the Temple Palace. One of the municipals wished to have the coffin carried out secretly by the door opening into the chapel enclosure, but M. Duisser, police commissary, who was specially entrusted with the arrangement of the ceremony, opposed this indecorous measure, and the procession passed out through the great gate. The crowd that was pressing round was kept back, and compelled to keep a line by a tricolored ribbon held at short distances by gendarmes. Compassion and sorrow were impressed on every countenance. A small detachment of the troops of the line from the garrison of Paris, sent by the authorities, was waiting to serve as an escort. The bier, still covered with the pall, was carried on a litter on the shoulders of 4 men, who relieved each other 2 at a time. It was preceded by 6 or 8 men, headed by a sergeant. The procession was accompanied a long way by the crowd, and a great number of persona followed it even to the cemetery. The name of Little Capet, and the more popular title of Dauphin, spread from lip to lip, with exclamations of pity and compassion. The funeral entered the cemetery of Sti. Marguerite, not by the church as some accounts assert, but by the old gate of the cemetery. The interment was made in the corner, on the left, at a distance of 8 or 9 feet from the enclosure wall, and at an equal distance from a small house, which subsequently served as a school. The grave was filled up, no mound marked its place, and not even a trace remained of the interment. Not till then did the commissaries of police and the municipality withdraw, and enter the house opposite the church to draw up the declaration of interment. It was nearly 9 o'clock, and still daylight. Release of Madame Royale, her marriage to the Duc d'Angoulême, return to France death. The last person to hear of the sad events in the Temple was the one for whom they had the deepest and most painful interest. After her brother's death, the captivity of Madame Royale was much lightened. She was allowed to walk in the Temple gardens, and to receive visits from some ladies of the old court, and from Madame de Chantereine, who at last, after several times evading her questions, ventured cautiously to tell her of the deaths of her mother, aunt, and brother. Madame Royale wept bitterly, but had much difficulty in expressing her feelings. She spoke so confusedly, says Madame de la Ramière in a letter to Madame de Verneuil, that it was difficult to understand her. It took her more than a month's reading aloud, with careful study of pronunciation, to make herself intelligible, so much had she lost the power of expression. She was dressed with plainness amounting to poverty, and her hands were disfigured by exposure to cold and by the menial work she had been so long accustomed to do for herself, and which it was difficult to persuade her to leave off. When urged to accept the services of an attendant, she replied, with a sad prevision of the vicissitudes of her future life, that she did not like to form a habit which she might have again to abandon. She suffered herself, however, to be persuaded gradually to modify her recluse and ascetic habits. It was well she did so, as a preparation for the great changes about to follow. 9 days after the death of her brother, the city of Orleans interceded for the daughter of Louis Roman XVI, and sent deputies to the convention to pray for her deliverance and restoration to her family. Names followed this example, and Charette, on the part of the Vendeans, demanded, as a condition of the pacification of La Vendée, that the princess should be allowed to join her relations. At length, the convention decreed that Madame Royale should be exchanged with Austria for the representatives and ministers, whom Dumouriez had given up to the Prince of Coburg, Drouet, Semonville, Marat, and other prisoners of importance. At midnight on 19th December, 1795, which was her birthday, the princess was released from prison. The Minister of the Interior, M. Benizet, to avoid attracting public attention and possible disturbance, conducting her on foot from the temple to a neighboring street where his carriage awaited her. She made it her particular request that Gamin, who had been so devoted to her brother, should be the commissary appointed to accompany her to the frontier. Madame de Saucy, formerly under governess to the children of France, was also in attendance, and the princess took with her a dog named Coco, which had belonged to Louis Roman XVI. The mention of the little dog taken from the temple by Madame Royale reminds me how fond all the family were of these creatures. Each princess kept a different kind. Mesdames had beautiful spaniels. Little greyhounds were preferred by Madame Elizabeth. Louis Roman XVI was the only one of all his family who had no dogs in his room. I remember one day waiting in the great gallery for the king's retiring, when he entered with all his family and the whole pack, who were escorting him. All at once all the dogs began to bark, one louder than another, and ran away, passing like ghosts along those great dark rooms, which rang with their hoarse cries. The princesses shouting, calling them, running everywhere after them completed a ridiculous spectacle, which made those august persons very merry. De Hezec's, p. 49. She was frequently recognized on her way through France, and always with marks of pleasure and respect. It might have been supposed that the princess would rejoice to leave behind her the country which had been the scene of so many horrors and such bitter suffering. But it was her birthplace, and it held the graves of all she loved. And as she crossed the frontier, she said to those around her, "I leave France with regret, for I shall never cease to consider it my country." She arrived in Vienna on 9th January, 1796, and her first care was to attend a memorial service for her murdered relatives. After many weeks of close retirement, she occasionally began to appear in public, and people looked with interest at the pale, grave, slender girl of 17, dressed in the deepest mourning, over whose young head such terrible storms had swept. The emperor wished her to marry the Archduke Charles of Austria, but her father and mother had, even in the cradle, destined her hand for her cousin, the Duc d'Angoulême, son of the Comte d'Artois, and the memory of their lightest wish was law to her. Her quiet determination entailed anger and opposition amounting to persecution. Every effort was made to alienate her from her French relations. She was urged to claim Provence, which had become her own if Louis Roman XVIII was to be considered King of France. A pressure of opinion was brought to bear upon her, which might well have overawed so young a girl. "I was sent for to the emperor's cabinet," she writes, "where I found the imperial family assembled. The ministers and chief imperial counselors were also present. When the emperor invited me to express my opinion, I answered that to be able to treat fittingly of such interests I thought, I ought to be surrounded not only by my mother's relatives, but also by those of my father. Besides, I said, I was above all things French, and in entire subjection to the laws of France, which had rendered me alternately the subject of the king my father, the king my brother, and the king my uncle, and that I would yield obedience to the latter, whatever might be his commands. This declaration appeared very much to dissatisfy all who were present, and when they observed that I was not to be shaken, they declared that my right being independent of my will, my resistance would not be the slightest obstacle to the measures they might deem it necessary to adopt for the preservation of my interests. In their anxiety to make a German princess of Marie Therese, her imperial relations suppressed her French title as much as possible. When, with some difficulty, the Duc de Gramont succeeded in obtaining an audience of her and used the familiar form of address, she smiled faintly and bade him beware. "Call me Madame de Bretagne, or de Bourgogne, or de Lorraine," she said, "for here I am so identified with these provinces which the Emperor wished her to claim from her uncle Louis Roman XVIII, that I shall end in believing in my own transformation." After these discussions, she was so closely watched, and so many restraints were imposed upon her, that she was scarcely less a prisoner than in the old days of the Temple, though her cage was this time gilded. Rescue, however, was at hand. In 1798, Louis Roman XVIII accepted a refuge offered to him at Midau by the Tsar Paul, who had promised that he would grant his guest's first request, whatever it might be. Louis begged the Tsar to use his influence with the court of Vienna to allow his niece to join him. "Monsieur, my brother," was Paul's answer, "Madame Royale shall be restored to you, or I shall cease to be Paul I." Next morning the Tsar dispatched a courier to Vienna with a demand for the princess, so energetically worded that refusal must have been followed by war. Accordingly, in May 1799, Madame Royale was allowed to leave the capital, which she had found so uncongenial an asylum. In the old ducal castle of Midau, the capital of Kurland, Louis Roman XVIII, and his wife with their nephews, the Ducs d'Angoulême and de Berry, were awaiting her, attended by the Abbé Edgeworth as chief ecclesiastic and a little court of refugee nobles and officers. The Duc d'Angoulême was quiet and reserved. He loved hunting as means of killing time, was given to early hours and innocent pleasures. He was a gentleman and brave as became one. He had not the gentlemanly vices of his brother, and was all the better for it. He was ill-educated, but had natural good sense, and would have passed for having more than that had he cared to put forth pretensions. Of all his family, he was the one most ill-spoken of, and least deserving of it, Dr. Doran. With them were two men of humbler position, who must have been even more welcome to Madame Royale, de Malden, who had acted as courier to Louis Roman XVI. During the flight to Varennes, and Turgy, who had waited on the princesses in the temple. It was a sad meeting, though so long anxiously desired, and it was followed on 10th June, 1799, by an equally sad wedding, exiles, pensioners on the bounty of the Russian monarch, fulfilling an engagement founded, not on personal preference, but on family policy and reverence for the wishes of the dead. The bride and bridegroom had small cause for rejoicing. During the 18 months of tranquil seclusion which followed her marriage, the favorite occupation of the Duchess was visiting and relieving the poor. In January 1801, the Tsar Paul, in compliance with the demand of Napoleon, who was just then the object of his capricious enthusiasm, ordered the French royal family to leave Midau. Their wanderings commenced on the 21st, a day of bitter memories, and the young Duchess led the king to his carriage through a crowd of men, women, and children, whose tears and blessings attended them on their way. The queen was too ill to travel. The Duc d'Angoulême took another route to join a body of French gentlemen in arms for the legitimist cause. The exiles asked permission from the King of Prussia to settle in his dominions, and while awaiting his answer at Munich, they were painfully surprised by the entrance of 5 old soldiers of noble birth, part of the bodyguard they had left behind at Midau, relying on the protection of Paul. The Mad Tsar had decreed their immediate expulsion, and penniless and almost starving, they made their way to Louis Roman XVIII. All the money the royal family possessed was bestowed on these faithful servants, who came to them in detachments for relief, and then the Duchess offered her diamonds to the Danish consul for an advance of 2,000 ducats, saying she pledged her property, that in our common distress it may be rendered of real use to my uncle, his faithful servants, and myself. The Duchess's consistent and unselfish kindness procured her from the king, and those about him who knew her best, the name of our angel. Warsaw was for a brief time the resting place of the wanderers, but there they were disturbed in 1803 by Napoleon's attempt to threaten and bribe Louis Roman XVIII into abdication. It was suggested that refusal might bring upon them expulsion from Prussia. "We are accustomed to suffering," was the king's answer, "and we do not dread poverty. I would, trusting in God, seek another asylum." In 1808, after many changes of scene, this asylum was sought in England, Gosfield Hall, Essex, being placed at their disposal by the Marquis of Buckingham. From Gosfield, the king moved to Hartwell Hall, a fine old Elizabethan mansion rented from Sir George Lee for L500 a year. A yearly grant of L24,000 was made to the exiled family by the British government, out of which 140 persons were supported, the royal dinner party generally numbering 24. At Hartwell, as in her other homes, the Duchess was most popular amongst the poor. In general society she was cold and reserved, and she disliked the notice of strangers. In March 1814, the royalist successes at Bordeaux paved the way for the restoration of royalty in France, and amidst general sympathy and congratulation, with the Prince Regent himself to wish them good fortune, the King, the Duchess, and their suite left Hartwell in April 1814. The return to France was as triumphant as a somewhat half-hearted and doubtful enthusiasm could make it, and most of such cordiality as there was fell to the share of the Duchess. As she passed to Notre Dame in May 1814, on entering Paris, she was vociferously greeted. The feeling of loyalty, however, was not much longer lived than the applause by which it was expressed. The Duchess had scarcely effected one of the strongest wishes of her heart, the identification of what remained of her parents' bodies, and the magnificent ceremony with which they were removed from the cemetery of the Madeleine to the Abbey of St. Denis, when the escape of Napoleon from Elba in February 1815 scattered the royal family and their followers like chaff before the wind. The Duc d'Angoulême, compelled to capitulate at Toulouse, sailed from Sète in a Swedish vessel. The Comte d'Artois, the Duc de Berry, and the Prince de Condé withdrew beyond the frontier. The king fled from the capital. The Duchesse d'Angoulême, then at Bordeaux, celebrating the anniversary of the proclamation of Louis Roman XVIII, alone of all her family made any stand against the general panic. Day after day, she mounted her horse and reviewed the National Guard. She made personal and even passionate appeals to the officers and men, standing firm, and prevailing on a handful of soldiers to remain by her, even when the imperialist troops were on the other side of the river, and their cannon were directed against the square where the Duchess was reviewing her scanty followers. "It was the Duchesse d'Angoulême who saved you," said the gallant General Clausel after these events to a royalist volunteer. "I could not bring myself to order such a woman to be fired upon at the moment when she was providing material for the noblest page in her history." Filia Dolorosa, Volume Roman 7, p. 131. With pain and difficulty she was convinced that resistance was vain. Napoleon's banner soon floated over Bordeaux. The Duchess issued a farewell proclamation to her brave Bordelais, and on the 1st April, 1815, she started for Pouillac, whence she embarked for Spain. During a brief visit to England, she heard that the reign of 100 days was over, and the 27th of July, 1815, saw her second triumphal return to the Tuileries. She did not take up her abode there with any wish for state ceremonies or court gaieties. Her life was as secluded as her position would allow. Her favorite retreat was the pavilion, which had been inhabited by her mother, and in her little oratory she collected relics of her family, over which on the anniversaries of their deaths she wept and prayed. In her daily drives through Paris, she scrupulously avoided the spot on which they had suffered, and the memory of the past seemed to rule all her sad and self-denying life, both in what she did and what she refrained from doing. She was so methodical and economical, though liberal in her charities, that one of her regular evening occupations was to tear off the seals from the letters she had received during the day, in order that the wax might be melted down and sold. The produce made one poor family passing rich with £40 a year. See Filia Dolorosa, Volume Roman 2, p. 239. Her somewhat austere goodness was not of a nature to make her popular. The few who really understood her loved her, but the majority of her pleasure-seeking subjects regarded her either with ridicule or dread. She is said to have taken no part in politics, and to have exerted no influence in public affairs, but her sympathies were well known and the very word liberty made her shudder. Like Madame Roland, she had seen so many crimes perpetrated under that name. The claims of 3 pretended Dauphins Hervagault, the son of the tailor of St. Lo, Bruno, son of the shoemaker of Virgin, and Nondorf or Norndorf, the watchmaker, somewhat troubled her peace, but never for a moment obtained her sanction. Of the many other pseudo-Dauphins, said to number 12.5, not even the names remain. In February 1820, a fresh tragedy befell the royal family in the assassination of the Duc de Berry, brother-in-law of the Duchesse d'Angoulême, as he was seeing his wife into her carriage at the door of the opera house. He was carried into the theater, and there the dying prince and his wife were joined by the duchess, who remained till he breathed his last, and was present when he, too, was laid in the Abbey of St. Denis. She was present also when his son, the Duc de Bordeaux, was born, and hoped that she saw in him a guarantee for the stability of royalty in France. In September 1824, she stood by the deathbed of Louis Roman XVIII, and thenceforward her chief occupation was directing the education of the little Duc de Bordeaux, who generally resided with her at Villeneuve-l'Etang, her country house near St. Cloud. Thence she went in July 1830 to the Baths of Vichy, stopping at Dijon on her way to Paris, and visiting the theater on the evening of the 27th. She was received with a roar of execrations and seditious cries, and knew only too well what they signified. She instantly left the theater and proceeded to Tunner, where she received news of the rising in Paris, and, quitting the town by night, was driven to Joigny with 3 attendants. Soon after leaving that place, it was thought more prudent that the party should separate and proceed on foot, and the Duchess and M. de Faucigny, disguised as peasants, entered Versailles arm-in-arm to obtain tidings of the king. The Duchess found him at Rambouillet with her husband, the Dauphin, and the king met her with a request for pardon, being fully conscious, too late, that his unwise decrees and his headlong flight had destroyed the last hopes of his family. The act of abdication followed, by which the prospect of royalty passed from the Dauphin and his wife, as well as from Charles X, Henry V, being proclaimed king, and the Duc d'Orléans, who refused to take the boy monarch under his personal protection, lieutenant general of the kingdom. Then began the Duchess's 3rd expatriation. At Cherbourg, the royal family, accompanied by the little king without a kingdom, embarked in the Great Britain, which stood out to sea. The Duchess, remaining on deck for a last look at the coast of France, noticed a brig which kept, she thought, suspiciously near them. "Who commands that vessel?" she inquired. "Captain Thibault." "And what are his orders?" "To fire into and sink the vessels in which we sail, should any attempt be made to return to France." Such was the farewell of their subjects to the House of Bourbon. The fugitives landed at Weymouth, the Duchesse d'Angoulême under the title of Comtesse de Marne, the Duchesse de Berry as Comtesse de Rosny, and her son, Henry de Bordeaux, as Comte de Chambord, the title he retained till his death, originally taken from the estate presented to him in infancy by his enthusiastic people. Holyrood, with its royal and gloomy associations, was their appointed dwelling. The Duc and Duchesse d'Angoulême and the daughter of the Duc de Berry traveled thither by land, the king and the young Comte de Chambord by sea. "I prefer my route to that of my sister," observed the latter, "because I shall see the coast of France again, and she will not." The French government soon complained that at Holyrood the exiles were still too near their native land, and accordingly, in 1832, Charles X, with his son and grandson, left Scotland for Hamburg, while the Duchesse d'Angoulême and her niece repaired to Vienna. The family were reunited at Prague in 1833, where the birthday of the Comte de Chambord was celebrated with some pomp and rejoicing, many legitimists flocking thither to congratulate him on attaining the age of 13, which the old law of monarchical France had fixed as the majority of her princes. 3 years later, the wanderings of the unfortunate family recommenced. The Emperor Francis Roman II was dead, and his successor, Ferdinand, must visit Prague to be crowned, and Charles X feared that the presence of a discrowned monarch might be embarrassing on such an occasion. Illness and sorrow attended the exiles on their new journey, and a few months after they were established in the chateau of Grafenberg at Goritz, Charles X died of cholera in his 80th year. At Goritz also, on the 31st May, 1844, the Duchesse d'Angoulême, who had sat beside so many deathbeds, watched over that of her husband. Theirs had not been a marriage of affection in youth, but they respected each other's virtues, and to a great extent shared each other's tastes. Banishment and suffering had united them very closely, and of late years they had been almost inseparable, walking, riding, and reading together. When the Duchesse d'Angoulême had seen her husband laid by his father's side in the vault of the Franciscan convent, she, accompanied by her nephew and niece, removed to Frostorf, where they spent 7 tranquil years. Here she was addressed as queen by her household for the first time in her life, but she herself always recognized Henry, Comte de Chambord, as her sovereign. The Duchess lived to see the overthrow of Louis Philippe, the usurper of the inheritance of her family. Her last attempt to exert herself was a characteristic one. She tried to rise from a sickbed in order to attend the memorial service held for her mother, Marie Antoinette, on the 16th October, the anniversary of her execution. But her strength was not equal to the task. On the 19th she expired, with her hand in that of the Comte de Chambord, and on 28th October, 1851, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, Duchesse d'Angoulême, was buried in the Franciscan convent. The ceremony of expiation. In the spring of 1814, a ceremony took place in Paris at which I was present, because there was nothing in it that could be mortifying to a French heart. The death of Louis Roman XVI had long been admitted to be one of the most serious misfortunes of the Revolution. The Emperor Napoleon never spoke of that sovereign but in terms of the highest respect, and always prefixed the epithet unfortunate to his name. The ceremony to which I allude was proposed by the Emperor of Russia and the King of Prussia. It consisted of a kind of expiation and purification of the spot on which Louis Roman XVI and his queen were beheaded. I went to see the ceremony, and I had a place at a window in the hotel of Madame de Remusat, next to the Hotel de Crillon, and what was termed the Hotel de Curland. The expiation took place on the 10th of April. The weather was extremely fine and warm for the season. The Emperor of Russia and King of Prussia, accompanied by Prince Schwarzenberg, took their station at the entrance of the Rue Real, the King of Prussia being on the right of the Emperor Alexander and Prince Schwarzenberg on his left. There was a long parade, during which the Russian, Prussian, and Austrian military bands vied with each other in playing the air, Vive Henry Roman IV. The cavalry defiled past, and then withdrew into the Champs-Élysées, but the infantry ranged themselves round an altar which was raised in the middle of the place, and which was elevated on a platform having 12 or 15 steps. The Emperor of Russia alighted from his horse, and, followed by the King of Prussia, the Grand Duke Constantine, Lord Cathcart, and Prince Schwarzenberg, advanced to the altar. When the Emperor had nearly reached the altar, the Te Deum commenced. At the moment of the benediction, the sovereigns and persons who accompanied them, as well as the 25,000 troops who covered the place, all knelt down. The Greek priest presented the cross to the Emperor Alexander, who kissed it. His example was followed by the individuals who accompanied him, though they were not of the Greek faith. On rising, the Grand Duke Constantine took off his hat, and immediately salvos of artillery were heard. Note: the following titles have the signification given below during the period covered by this work. Monseigneur, the Dauphin. Monsieur, the eldest brother of the king, Comte de Provence, afterwards Louis Roman XVIII. Monsieur le Prince, the Prince de Condé, head of the House of Condé. Monsieur le Duc, the Duc de Bourbon, the eldest son of the Prince de Condé, and the father of the Duc d'Enghien shot by Napoleon. Monsieur le Grand, the Grand Equerry under the Ancien Regime. Monsieur le Premier, the first equerry under the Ancien Regime. Enfants de France, the royal children. Madame and Mesdames, sisters or daughters of the king, or princesses near the throne, sometimes used also for the wife of Monsieur, the eldest brother of the king, the princesses Adelaide, Victoire, Sophie, Louise, daughters of Louis Roman XV, and aunts of Louis Roman XVI. Madame Elizabeth, the Princess Elizabeth, sister of Louis Roman XVI. Madame Royale, the Princess Marie-Thérèse, daughter of Louis Roman XVI, afterwards Duchesse d'Angoulême. Mademoiselle, the daughter of Monsieur, the brother of the king. The edexed editor's bookmarks. A man born solely to contradict advised the king not to separate himself from his army. Ah, madame, we have all been killed in our master's service. Alas, her grief's double mine. Allowed her candles, and as much firewood as she wanted, better to die than to implicate anybody, brought me her daughter Hortense de Beauharnais, carried the idea of the prerogative of rank, to a high-pitch common and blamable practice of indulgence condescension, which renders approbation. More offensive customs are nearly equal to law's difference between brilliant theories and the simplest practice dignified tone, which alone secures the respect, due to power displaying her acquirements with rather too much. Confidence Duc d'Orleans, when called on to give his vote for death of King Elegant entertainments were given to Dr. Franklin etiquette still existed at court. Dignity alone was wanting extreme simplicity, was the Queen's first and only real mistake fashion of wearing a black coat without being in mourning favorite of a queen is not, in France, a happy one formed rather to endure calamity with patience than to contend grandeur, mamma. Will it be yesterday over again? Happiness does not dwell in palaces, he is afraid to command his ruin was resolved on. They passed to the order of the day his seraglio in the Parcock Surf's history of the man, with the iron mask. How can I have any regret when I partake your misfortunes? I hate all that savors of fanaticism. I do not like these rhapsodies. I love the conveniences of life too well, if ever I establish a republic of women. Indulge in the pleasure of vice and assume the credit of virtue king. Gave the fatal order to the Swiss to cease firing Lafayette to rescue the royal family and convey them to Rouen. Leave me in peace. Be assured that I can put no heir in danger. Louis Philippe. The usurper of the inheritance of her family Murraybow forgot that it was more easy to do harm than good. Most intriguing little Carmelite in the kingdom, my father fortunately found a library, which amused him. Never shall a drop of French blood be shed by my order. No, one is more dangerous than a man clothed with recent authority. No accounting for the caprices of a woman, no ears that will discover when she, the princess, is out of tune. None but little minds dreaded little books observe the least. Pretension on account of the rank or fortune of course, I shall be either hissed or applauded. On domestic management depends the preservation of their fortune. Prevent disorder from organizing itself. Princes, thus accustomed to be treated as divinities. Princess at 12 years, was not mistress of the whole alphabet rabble, always ready to insult genius, virtue, and misfortune. Saw no other advantage in it than that of saving her own life. She often carried her economy to a degree of parsimony shocking, to find so little a man in the son of the Merchel shun. All kinds of confident simplicity of the Queen's toilet began to be strongly censured, so many crimes perpetrated under that name. Liberty, spirit of party, can degrade the character of a nation, subjecting the vanquished to be tried by the conqueror's taken pains only to render himself beloved by his. Pupil tastes may change that air of truth which always carries conviction. The author, Beaumarchais, was sent to prison soon afterwards. The Jesuits were suppressed. The three ministers, more ambitious than amorous, the charge of extravagance. The emigrant party have their intrigues and schemes. The king delighted to manage the most disgraceful points. The anti-Austrian party, discontented and vindictive. There is not one real patriot among all this infamous horde. They say you live very poorly here. Molière. Those muskets were immediately embarked and sold to the Americans. Those who did it should not pretend to wish to remedy it to be formally mistress. A husband had to be found. True nobility, gentlemen, consists in giving proofs of it. Ventured to give such rash advice. Inoculation was but one brilliant action that she could perform. We must have obedience, and no reasoning. Well, this is royally ill played. What do young women stand in need of? Mothers. When kings become prisoners, they are very near death. While the Queen was blamed, she was blindly imitated. Whispered in his mother's ear, "Was that right? Would be a pity," she said, "to stop when so fairly on the road. Young prince suffered from the rickets. Your swords have rusted in their scabbards." End of the project. Gutenberg ebook of Memoirs of the Court of Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, complete by Madame Campan.